Welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping away from the established timeline to ask a different kind of question, one that lingers in the quiet spaces between fiction and reality. What if the events of Five Nights at Freddy's weren't confined to games and stories? What if somewhere in our world, a family entertainment center like Freddy Fazbear's Pizza actually existed, with its singing animatronics and birthday parties, its security cameras and night shifts? What if those spring-lock suits were real mechanical inventions, tested and deployed in actual restaurants? What if children really did go missing from within those walls? And what if the authorities, the families, the media, and the courts had to respond to something this devastating in our own timeline? This isn't about retelling the lore you already know. This is about examining what would actually happen if Fazbear Entertainment operated in our reality, bound by our laws, our technologies, our investigative procedures, and our very human capacity for both negligence and grief. We'll explore the real science behind animatronic entertainment, the actual protocols that activate when a child disappears, the genuine psychological toll on night security workers, and the legal machinery that grinds into motion when corporations fail to protect the innocent. We'll look at historical parallels, at theme park disasters and missing children cases that have shaped how our society responds to tragedy. We'll consider how the internet would react, how families would cope, and what kind of justice might or might not be served. And some of what we discuss will draw from documented incidents at major theme parks, from FBI child abduction protocols, from corporate scandal case law, and from psychological studies on shift work and trauma. Other parts will be thoughtful speculation, clearly labeled as such, about how existing systems would adapt to scenarios we hope never occur. Throughout, we'll maintain a measured, educational approach, treating the subject with the gravity it deserves, while exploring the fascinating intersection of fiction and the mechanisms of our actual world. Whether you're here to deepen your understanding of the systems that protect us in reality, to compare the game's narrative to actual procedures, or simply to let these thoughts wash over you as you drift toward sleep, this exploration will carry you through a detailed examination of what happens when childhood entertainment intersects with real-world tragedy. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey into a world where Freddy Fazbear's Pizza isn't just a setting in a horror game, but a real business that would have to navigate the complex machinery of law, technology, and human response in the year 2025. Before we dive in, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy these kinds of thoughtful, immersive explorations that blend gaming lore with real-world knowledge. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what aspects of this topic interest you most. Now, let's explore what would really happen if Five Nights at Freddy's came to life. The technology. Could animatronics like this actually exist? To understand whether Fazbear Entertainment could exist in reality, we first need to examine the technological foundation of their entire operation, those performing animatronic characters that define the brand. In our world, animatronic technology has been evolving since the early 1960s, pioneered primarily by Walt Disney's Imagineers, who coined the term audio animatronics to describe their sophisticated electromechanical puppets. These machines, which bring characters to life in theme parks worldwide, share surprising similarities with what we see in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe, and understanding their real-world mechanics helps us evaluate the plausibility of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and their companions existing as actual entertainment robots. How modern theme park animatronics operate through intricate systems of pneumatic and electric actuators computer controls, and programming that coordinates movements to create the illusion of life. Disney's most advanced figures, like the Shaman of Songs in Pandora at Animal Kingdom, represent the cutting edge of this technology. This particular animatronic, which debuted in 2017, features an unprecedented level of sophistication with fluid movements, detailed facial expressions, and synchronized audio that creates a remarkably lifelike presence. The technology behind such figures involves dozens of individual actuators controlling everything from major limb movements to subtle facial muscle simulations, all coordinated by advanced computer systems running complex motion profiles. However, and this sophistication comes with inherent vulnerabilities that would absolutely manifest in a real-world Fazbear entertainment scenario. In January 2025, the Shaman of Songs suffered a complete mechanical failure during regular operation. Guests witnessed the animatronic make a loud snapping sound before freezing entirely and collapsing in front of them, a malfunction captured on social media and widely circulated. Disney, with its massive maintenance budgets and engineering expertise, had anticipated such failures by implementing a backup system where a digital screen replaces the physical animatronic during technical difficulties. Yet even with these precautions and Disney's industry-leading standards, the failure still occurred, demonstrating that even the most advanced animatronic systems remain prone to unexpected mechanical breakdowns. This incident wasn't isolated. Throughout 2024 and 2025, Disney's Tiana's Bayou Adventure attraction experienced persistent animatronic malfunctions that became increasingly concerning to guests and industry observers. Multiple visitors reported seeing Princess Tiana animatronics with their necks tilting at unnatural angles, completely motionless figures despite their audio continuing to play. And in one particularly disturbing incident, an animatronic with its hair completely missing, exposing the mechanical components of its head. These failures violated Disney's strict show standards, which dictate that guests should never see broken illusions or exposed mechanics. Yet the attraction continued operating despite these obvious technical problems. In another case, at the Hall of Presidents, a George Washington animatronic malfunctioned during a performance, bending forward and freezing in an awkward position with its facial expressions locked, prompting an evacuation of the theater and early termination of the show. What makes these incidents particularly relevant to our examination of a real Fazbear entertainment is that they occur despite Disney's extraordinary commitment to maintenance and safety. Disney employs teams of specialized engineers, conducts daily inspections, uses advanced monitoring systems, and has virtually unlimited resources to maintain their animatronics. They follow rigorous protocols established by ASTM International, the organization that develops safety standards for the amusement industry, and they're subject to constant oversight from insurance companies and government regulators. Yet, even with all these safeguards, animatronics still fail, sometimes dramatically, and sometimes in ways that could startle or even frighten guests, especially children. Now imagine a company like Fazbear Entertainment operating as a mid-tier family restaurant chain rather than a multi-billion-dollar entertainment conglomerate. Based on typical industry patterns, their maintenance budgets would be a fraction of Disney's. Their engineering staff would likely consist of a few technicians rather than teams of specialized Imagineers. Economic realities suggest their animatronics would probably use older, less sophisticated technology to keep costs manageable, and the wear and tear from daily operation in a restaurant environment, with food particles, spilled liquids, and constant humidity from cooking, would accelerate mechanical degradation. Given these constraints, the realistic scenario isn't whether their animatronics would malfunction, but how frequently, how severely, and what consequences those failures might have for guests, especially young children attending birthday parties. The games hint at this reality through details like bad odors coming from the suits, decaying animatronics being relegated to parts and service, and the constant need for maintenance. In the real world, these wouldn't be ominous clues, but predictable outcomes of operating complex machinery in suboptimal conditions. Restaurant environments are harsh on equipment, grease in the air, and temperature fluctuations from kitchens, humidity, and the acidic nature of various food products all contribute to accelerated wear on mechanical and electronic components. An animatronic bear performing in a pizzeria would face environmental stresses that a climate-controlled theme park attraction never encounters. Then, there's the question of the spring-lock suits, which represent perhaps the most fantastical element of the FNAF technology that would be extraordinarily difficult to implement in reality. The concept, as presented in the games, involves suits that can function as both autonomous animatronics and wearable costumes, with internal mechanisms that compress when a person needs to wear the suit. The engineering challenges this presents are staggering, as to creating a mechanism that could reliably and safely compress dozens of metal components, hydraulic lines, and electronic systems while providing enough space for a human body, then reverse that process without catastrophic failure, would require engineering precision far beyond what we've achieved in robotics. The safety concerns are even more prohibitive. Any mechanism that could compress with enough force to move heavy metal components would, by definition, be capable of causing severe injury or death if it activated while a person was inside. The training tapes in the games acknowledge this, warning employees about moisture causing the spring locks to fail. But in reality, no safety regulatory body would ever approve such a system for commercial use. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, maintains strict requirements for any equipment that poses crushing or pinching hazards, and a spring lock suit would represent multiple catastrophic hazards that no amount of training could adequately mitigate. In our timeline, when theme parks have used costume character systems, they've relied on completely separate approaches. Walk-around characters in theme parks wear hollow foam costumes with no mechanical components, just a human performer inside a lightweight shell. Any animatronic elements are entirely separate figures that humans never enter. This separation exists precisely because combining human proximity with powerful mechanical systems creates unacceptable risk. The tragic death of a cast member at Universal Studios in 1986, when someone fell between tram cars and was crushed, or the injury to a worker found in the rafters of a ride building in 2016, demonstrates how even well-established theme park operations can experience fatal incidents with their equipment. A spring-lock suit would multiply those risks exponentially, but let's engage in some informed speculation about how a company might attempt to create something spring-lock adjacent in reality. Drawing from existing mechanical engineering principles, the most plausible approach would involve much simpler mechanics than the games suggest. Perhaps the spring lock system would really be a kind of quick-release framework where certain cosmetic elements could be temporarily removed or repositioned, creating just enough space for a performer to squeeze into a rigid exoskeleton. And this wouldn't involve the dramatic mechanical compression shown in the games, but rather a more mundane process of removing panels, detaching limbs, and having the performer carefully position themselves within a static frame. Evidence from costume design history suggests it would be uncomfortable, time-consuming to get in and out of, and would still pose significant risks from sharp edges, pinch points, and the sheer weight of the components. Even this simplified version would likely be abandoned after any incident. If we look at how real entertainment companies respond to safety concerns, we see that they tend to err on the side of extreme caution once problems emerge. When Disney's Pack Mule ride at Disneyland in the 1970s proved too unpredictable and caused multiple injuries, and they shut it down entirely, rather than trying to engineer better safety measures. When Universal experienced their fire incidents and other problems, they implemented sweeping changes to procedures and equipment. A springlock suit incident wouldn't prompt Fazbear Entertainment to improve the training. It would prompt them to retire the technology entirely and face whatever investigations, lawsuits, and regulatory actions followed. The International Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions, IAAPA, maintains that modern attractions are among the safest forms of recreation available, citing advanced materials, computer controls, and rigorous inspection protocols. But this safety record exists precisely because the industry has learned from past mistakes and maintains conservative approaches to risk. According to their annual reports, where attractions undergo daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly inspections. They're subject to manufacturer guidelines, insurance company requirements, and government regulations. Any equipment showing signs of problems gets immediately taken offline. These standards developed over decades, shaped by incidents that harmed guests and workers, and the resulting culture emphasizes preventing accidents rather than responding to them. A real Fazbear Entertainment entering the market would either need to meet these standards, which would make their animatronics expensive and their springlock suits probably impossible, or they would need to operate in a regulatory grey area, perhaps positioning themselves as a restaurant with entertainment rather than an amusement facility, potentially avoiding some of the stricter oversight. In historical precedent suggests this latter approach might work initially, but it would make them extremely vulnerable to regulatory action once any incident occurred. State and local authorities, insurance companies, and federal agencies like OSHA would all take interest in a business operating complex machinery around children without proper licensing and oversight. The technological reality, then, is that a Fazbear Entertainment could exist and could operate animatronic entertainment, but their equipment would likely be less sophisticated than what Disney builds, more prone to failure, and subject to either expensive regulatory compliance or dangerous cutting of corners. The springlock suits, if they existed at all, would probably be crude and dangerous, likely causing minor injuries during normal operation and carrying the constant risk of catastrophic failure. When we later discuss the business operations and legal consequences of incidents, we'll see how these technological limitations would create cascading problems throughout the entire operation. One more element worth examining is the endoskeletons, those exposed metal frameworks we see in the games. In real animatronics, the structural framework is carefully designed with smooth surfaces, protective coverings, and no exposed pinch points or sharp edges. The exposed, skeletal appearance of FNAF endoskeletons would violate basic safety standards because of the injury risks they present. If a child touched an operating animatronic and caught their hand in moving gears or between hydraulic components, the liability would be enormous. Real entertainment animatronics keep all mechanical components behind shells, covers, or barriers specifically to prevent such contact. This means the parts and service room full of exposed endoskeletons wouldn't exist as depicted in the games. Or if it did, contemporary safety regulations would require it be a secure maintenance area with restricted access and posted warnings. No employee would casually enter such a space at night as part of their security rounds. The presence of the dangerous equipment would trigger OSHA requirements for lockout and tagout procedures, confined space protocols, and personal protective equipment. Drawing from established workplace safety practices, a night security guard wouldn't just walk into a room full of partially disassembled animatronics with exposed mechanical hazards any more than they would stroll through an active construction site without authorization and safety gear. What this technological examination reveals is that while the core concept of animatronic entertainment is absolutely real and commercially viable, the specific implementations shown in FNAF either don't exist in our timeline because they're too dangerous, or they would require safety measures and oversight that would dramatically change how they function. The horror of the games relies partly on these machines acting in ways real animatronics shouldn't be able to, wandering freely through buildings, grabbing and stuffing people, operating without external power. In reality, animatronics are tethered to power sources, limited to designed ranges of motion, monitored by safety systems, and unable to operate autonomously in the way the games suggest. The gap between game fiction and engineering reality is substantial, and that gap represents both technological limitations and deliberate safety decisions made by our society to prevent exactly the kinds of tragedies that define the FNAF narrative. The business reality. Operating a family entertainment center. Understanding whether Fazbear Entertainment could exist requires looking beyond the technology to examine the business model itself. In our world, family entertainment centers represent a specific sector of the hospitality and entertainment industry, combining food service with games, attractions, and live performances. The most comparable real businesses would be chains like Chuck E. Cheese, which has operated since 1977 and pioneered the concept of combining pizza restaurants with arcade games and animatronic entertainment. By examining how these real businesses operate, we can understand both the viability and the vulnerabilities of a Fazbear-style operation. Chuck E. Cheese's parent company, CEC Entertainment, has faced significant challenges throughout its history that illustrate the difficulties of this business model. The company filed for bankruptcy in June 2020, citing massive debt and the impacts of the COVID pandemic, though it emerged from bankruptcy later that year under new ownership. But even before the pandemic, these venues struggled with changing consumer preferences, e-competition from home entertainment options, and the high cost of maintaining aging equipment. The animatronic shows, once a major draw, became increasingly dated, and many locations phased them out in favor of simpler, less maintenance-intensive entertainment options. This real-world trajectory suggests that a Fazbear Entertainment would face similar pressures, potentially leading to cost-cutting measures that could compromise safety and maintenance. The economics of running a family entertainment center with animatronics are brutal. The upfront costs are substantial, because custom animatronics aren't cheap. Even relatively simple figures can cost tens of thousands of dollars, while sophisticated ones like Disney builds can run into hundreds of thousands or even millions. A Fazbear Entertainment opening a new location would need to invest not just in the animatronics themselves, but in the infrastructure to support them. Reinforced stages, specialized lighting and sound systems, control computers, and backup power systems. Then there's the ongoing maintenance, which requires specialized technicians, replacement parts, regular inspections, and the inevitable rebuilds when components wear out. Meanwhile, the revenue model relies heavily on birthday parties and family visits, markets that are highly competitive and price-sensitive. Parents have countless options for children's entertainment, from trampoline parks to bowling alleys to movie theaters to home parties with rented bounce houses. To compete, family entertainment centers often need to keep prices relatively low, which means thin profit margins, and they make up for this through volume, packing in as many parties and visitors as possible, which creates its own problems. Crowded facilities, overworked staff, faster equipment deterioration, and increased accident risks. The staffing challenges would be particularly acute for a Fazbear-style business. Family entertainment centers typically employ a mix of teenagers and young adults in entry-level positions. Hosts for birthday parties, kitchen staff, game attendants, and maintenance workers. Turnover is high because the pay is usually at or near minimum wage. The hours include nights and weekends, and the work can be physically demanding and stressful. Training is often minimal because of the constant need to replace departing employees, and this workforce reality creates serious safety concerns because operating and maintaining complex animatronic equipment properly requires skill and consistent oversight. That's hard to achieve with a revolving door of inexperienced workers. Security presents another challenge. The games focus heavily on the night security position, but in reality, most family entertainment centers don't employ dedicated security guards at all, especially overnight. When these businesses close, they typically just lock the doors and rely on standard commercial alarm systems monitored by external security companies. Overnight security guards are expensive, and for a business operating on thin margins, that expense is hard to justify unless required by insurance or local regulations. If a real Fazbear Entertainment did employ night guards, they would likely be contracted through a third-party security company rather than direct employees, and they would be paid low wages to perform basic rounds rather than intensively monitoring animatronics through an elaborate camera system. Now, let's consider the regulatory environment. Any business operating in the United States that serves food and provides entertainment for children faces extensive regulation from multiple agencies. Health departments regulate food safety, requiring permits, inspections, proper food handling training, and compliance with sanitation codes. Fire marshals regulate building safety, occupancy limits, emergency exits, and fire suppression systems. Building departments enforce construction and electrical codes. If the business serves alcohol, liquor control boards impose additional requirements. And crucially for our scenario, any mechanical equipment that could pose safety risks falls under OSHA oversight, state labor departments, and potentially specific amusement ride safety regulations depending on jurisdiction. Different states handle amusement safety differently. Some have strong regulatory frameworks with dedicated state inspectors, required insurance, and strict enforcement. Others have minimal oversight, essentially leaving safety up to individual businesses and relying on liability concerns to motivate compliance. A company like Fazbear Entertainment would likely seek locations in states with weaker regulation to minimize costs and oversight, a strategy employed by various businesses throughout history. And this regulatory arbitrage creates a situation where the same company might operate much more safely in California or New Jersey than in states with more relaxed enforcement. Insurance represents another critical constraint. To operate legally, Fazbear Entertainment would need general liability insurance to cover customer injuries, property insurance for their buildings and equipment, workers' compensation insurance for employees, and potentially specialized policies for their animatronic attractions if insurers classified them as amusement devices. The insurance industry is notoriously risk-averse, and underwriters would carefully evaluate the company's operations, safety record, and procedures. After any significant incident, premiums would skyrocket, or coverage might be denied entirely, potentially making it economically impossible to continue operating. This is where business realities intersect with the trajectory we see in the games. A company that experienced what Fazbear Entertainment goes through, the bite incidents, missing children, suspicious circumstances, would face catastrophic insurance and regulatory consequences. Their liability insurance would either be cancelled or renewed at prohibitively high rates. They would face intense scrutiny from multiple government agencies. Local jurisdictions would likely revoke operating permits or impose onerous conditions. Even if the company wanted to continue operating, the practical obstacles would be immense. Major theme parks manage these challenges because they have massive resources, professional management, and reputations to protect. Disney, Universal, and similar operators invest heavily in safety because they understand that their brands depend on public trust. They maintain large legal and regulatory compliance departments. They conduct extensive internal investigations of any incident. They settle lawsuits quickly to avoid negative publicity. They implement changes proactively rather than waiting for regulators to force them. A mid-tier restaurant chain wouldn't have these capabilities or resources. Let's examine what would realistically happen after something like the bite of 87 in our world. An animatronic severely injuring a customer during operating hours would trigger immediate responses from multiple directions. First, emergency services would be called, and the victim would be transported to a hospital. Paramedics and emergency room staff would be required to report certain types of injuries to authorities. The local police would respond to take statements and document the scene. If the injury was severe, detectives might become involved to determine if any criminal negligence occurred. OSHA would be notified and would likely conduct an investigation, especially if it was determined that the animatronic represented a workplace hazard to employees as well. They have jurisdiction over workplace safety, and if they found that the company failed to properly maintain equipment, provide adequate safety procedures, or protect workers and customers from known hazards, they could issue citations and fines. In serious cases, they could shut down operations until corrections were made. State labor departments might also investigate, and particularly if the incident revealed unsafe working conditions. The state or local agency responsible for amusement safety, if one exists in that jurisdiction, would also investigate. They would examine the animatronic, review maintenance records, interview staff, and determine whether the equipment met applicable safety standards. They have the authority to prohibit operation of specific equipment or entire facilities if they find unsafe conditions. Even in states without dedicated amusement safety agencies, building departments or consumer protection offices might become involved. The company's insurance carrier would conduct its own investigation to determine liability and potential payout amounts. They would send adjusters to examine the scene and equipment, interview witnesses, and review policies and procedures. Based on their findings, they might advise the company to immediately cease operating certain equipment, increase safety measures, or even close temporarily. The insurance investigation would focus on whether the company's negligence contributed to the incident, because that would affect both the claim payout and future coverage decisions. Civil lawsuits would follow almost immediately. The victim's family would hire a personal injury attorney who would file suit against the company, possibly also naming individual managers or employees as defendants. The legal process would involve extensive discovery, where attorneys request internal documents, maintenance records, training materials, previous incident reports, and depositions from employees. This process often reveals problems beyond the specific incident that triggered the suit, and creating additional legal exposure. If multiple incidents occurred, as happens in the FNAF timeline, the legal and regulatory pressures would intensify dramatically. Pattern evidence becomes extremely damaging in litigation. If attorneys could show that the company knew about recurring problems with their animatronics and failed to address them adequately, that would support claims of willful negligence or even reckless endangerment. Class action lawsuits might be filed on behalf of multiple victims. State attorneys general might pursue consumer protection cases. The company would quickly find itself in a defensive posture, spending enormous amounts on legal fees while its reputation deteriorated. Media coverage would amplify all these problems. In our current era of social media and 24-hour news cycles, a child being seriously injured by an animatronic at a family restaurant would become national news within hours. Cell phone videos would circulate widely. Local news would interview witnesses and the victim's family. National outlets would cover it as a cautionary tale about corporate negligence. The company's social media would be flooded with angry comments and calls for boycotts. This publicity would damage the brand far beyond the specific locations involved, affecting business nationwide. The business model would become unsustainable rapidly. Existing customers would avoid the restaurants, new customer acquisition would plummet, and revenue would decline sharply, while costs related to investigations, lawsuits, and enhanced security measures increased. Landlords of leased locations might seek to terminate agreements based on reputation damage or safety concerns. Franchise operators, if the company used that model, would revolt or seek to rebrand under different names. Suppliers and vendors might demand payment in advance or refuse service altogether. Employees would seek other jobs, making staffing even more difficult. This cascade of business failures explains why the FNAF timeline includes multiple restaurant closures, reopenings under new management, and attempts to rebrand. In reality, a company facing these challenges would likely go through bankruptcy reorganization, possibly multiple times. Bankruptcy would allow them to shed liabilities, terminate unfavorable contracts, and restructure operations. But it wouldn't erase the fundamental problems of dangerous equipment and public distrust. Most likely, the company would eventually be liquidated, with its assets sold off and the brand abandoned. However, there's a darker possibility that the games hint at, and that has real-world parallels. A company in crisis might engage in cover-ups, evidence destruction, or other illegal activities to avoid liability and continue operating. Corporate malfeasance in the face of safety issues is well documented in various industries. Companies have hidden defects, destroyed records, intimidated witnesses, and misled regulators when they felt their survival was threatened. This behavior, while criminal, emerges from the desperate logic of organizations fighting for existence. We'll examine these patterns more closely when we discuss corporate cover-ups later. But it's worth noting here that the business pressures facing a troubled Fazbear Entertainment would create powerful incentives for unethical behavior. The economic reality of family entertainment centers, combined with the regulatory and legal framework of our timeline, means that a Fazbear Entertainment experiencing the incidents shown in the games would not simply continue operating location after location for decades. The business model wouldn't support it, the legal system wouldn't allow it, and the market wouldn't tolerate it. What we'd more likely see is a brief period of operation, a catastrophic incident or series of incidents, then either rapid transformation into a completely different business or outright closure and bankruptcy. And the enduring presence of Fazbear Entertainment across multiple games requires accepting that their fictional universe has very different legal, regulatory, and market constraints than our reality possesses. When entertainment venues go wrong, real-world incidents and responses. To understand what would happen when things went wrong at a real Fazbear Entertainment, we need to examine how similar incidents have actually unfolded at entertainment venues in our world. Theme parks, amusement centers, and entertainment facilities have experienced tragedies that offer sobering parallels to the FNAF scenarios. And studying these real cases reveals both how society responds to such events and how different the outcomes are from the game's narrative. One of the most relevant recent incidents occurred in March 2022 at Icon Park in Orlando, Florida. A 14-year-old boy fell to his death from the Orlando Freefall ride, a drop tower attraction. The young man, identified as Tyre Sampson, fell from his seat during the ride's descent because his safety restraint was not properly secured. Investigation revealed that the restraint had been manually adjusted beyond manufacturer specifications, allowing it to open further than designed, and staff failed to detect this dangerous condition before dispatching the ride. The tragedy sparked immediate state investigation, a criminal probe, civil lawsuits from the family, and ultimately led to the permanent closure of the attraction. What's instructive about this case is the rapid and comprehensive response it triggered. Within hours of the incident, state authorities were on scene investigating. The ride was immediately closed, and Florida's Department of Agriculture, which oversees amusement rides in the state, launched a formal investigation. The manufacturer was contacted to examine the equipment. Security footage was reviewed. Staff were interviewed. Within weeks, the investigation revealed that the restraint had been modified, and that this modification, combined with inadequate staff training and oversight, directly caused the death. Criminal charges were considered against those responsible for the improper modification and operation. The civil litigation moved forward swiftly. The family retained attorneys who filed wrongful death lawsuits against the ride operator, the park, the manufacturer, and potentially other parties. And these lawsuits would seek compensation for the death, but they would also serve to expose through discovery what internal communications, training records, and previous safety concerns might have existed. Settlement negotiations would likely occur, possibly resulting in a significant payout and mandatory safety improvements. The case would establish legal precedent for similar situations. Critically, similar drop tower rides at other locations across the country were immediately scrutinized. Operators checked their equipment and procedures. Some temporarily closed as a precaution. Regulatory agencies in various states increased inspection frequency. The manufacturer issued safety bulletins. This ripple effect demonstrates how a single incident at one location can impact the entire industry, enforcing systemic improvements even at facilities that weren't directly involved. Now contrast this response with what happens in the FNAF universe after the Bite of 87. In the games, the incident is mentioned as historical fact, but operations apparently continue at various locations, albeit with new rules about animatronics being confined to the stage during the day. the company doesn't face the kind of existential crisis that would result from a child suffering a severe head injury from an animatronic bite in our reality. This divergence from real-world consequences is necessary for the game's narrative to work, but it's important to understand just how different the real response would be. Consider Disney's recent animatronic fire in their Fantasmique show in April 2023. The dragon animatronic used in the nighttime spectacular at Disneyland caught fire during a performance, creating a dramatic scene as flames engulfed the large mechanical figure. Emergency protocols were activated immediately. The show was stopped, guests were evacuated from the viewing area, and fire crews responded to extinguish the blaze. Several cast members were treated for smoke inhalation, but thankfully no one was seriously injured. Disney suspended the Fantasmic show indefinitely following the incident, not allowing it to reopen until after a thorough investigation of what caused the fire and what changes were needed to prevent recurrence. This was Disney, a company with effectively unlimited resources and a sterling safety reputation, are responding to an incident where no guests were injured, and the damage was primarily to equipment. They still shut down the show for an extended period, conducted comprehensive reviews, and likely implemented numerous behind-the-scenes changes before resuming operations. This conservative approach reflects both Disney's commitment to safety and their understanding that their business model depends on public trust. Any perception that they're operating unsafe attractions would be devastating to their brand. Now imagine a mid-tier restaurant chain facing an incident where a child was actually harmed by their signature entertainment. The response would be exponentially more severe than Disney's reaction to an equipment fire. Every location in the chain would likely be required to shut down their animatronic shows pending inspection. State regulators would potentially force closures. Insurance carriers might suspend coverage. The media scrutiny would be intense and ongoing. Parent groups would organize boycotts. Competitors would emphasize their safety records in advertising. The commercial impact would be catastrophic. The Universal Studios backlot fires offer another instructive case study. Universal Studios Hollywood has experienced multiple fires throughout its history, including a significant one in June 2008 that destroyed several sets and attractions. These fires, while devastating to the studio, occurred in areas that were either not open to guests at the time or were quickly evacuated. Even so, each incident triggered extensive investigations, led to improved fire suppression systems and safety protocols, and resulted in temporary closures of affected areas. Universal's response demonstrated the principle that when dangerous incidents occur, even at major entertainment facilities with strong safety records, the appropriate response is to stop operations, investigate thoroughly, implement improvements, and only then resume. One of the most tragic theme park incidents in recent memory occurred on July 5, 2009, when two Disney monorail trains collided at Walt Disney World in Florida, killing the pilot of one train. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation revealed that the accident resulted from human error in operating track switches, combined with communication failures. Though this involved transportation rather than an attraction, the response illustrates how seriously such incidents are treated. So the monorail system was shut down for inspection and safety review. New sensors and operating procedures were implemented before service resumed. Training protocols were revised. The responsible parties faced consequences. Disney settled with the victim's family. This comprehensive response occurred even though Disney's monorail system has an otherwise exemplary safety record across decades of operation. These real-world examples establish several consistent patterns. First, when serious incidents occur at entertainment facilities, the immediate response is to stop operations of the involved equipment or attraction. Second, multiple agencies and organizations initiate investigations simultaneously, including operators, regulators, manufacturers, insurance companies, and law enforcement. Third, the incidents receive significant media coverage that impacts the business beyond just the direct consequences. Fourth, civil litigation proceeds parallel to regulatory action. Fifth, the entire industry often responds with enhanced scrutiny and preventive measures at similar facilities. Applying these patterns to a Fazbear Entertainment scenario reveals how different the real outcome would be from the games. After a bite incident, the animatronics involved would be immediately shut down and impounded as evidence. All Fazbear locations would likely be required to cease animatronic performances pending investigation. The company would face pressure from regulators, insurers, landlords, and the public to either permanently retire the problematic technology or implement safety measures so extensive they would fundamentally change the business model. The idea that operations would simply continue with minor rule changes doesn't align with how our system actually functions. Consider also the incident at Extreme World in Wisconsin Dells in 2010, where a 12-year-old girl died while riding the terminal velocity attraction. This ride dropped participants into a net without using harnesses, relying instead on the net to catch them safely. When a fatality occurred, the response was swift and permanent. The ride was shut down. The facility faced intense scrutiny. Lawsuits were filed, and ultimately, such attractions came under much greater regulatory oversight. The incident effectively ended that specific type of unrestrained drop attraction at facilities across the country. One death led to systemic industry changes. In the FNAF timeline, we have multiple severe incidents across multiple locations over multiple years. Yet Fazbear Entertainment continues operating in various forms. This persistence requires the company to be operating in a fictional universe where regulatory oversight is much weaker, legal consequences are less severe, or public memory is much shorter than in our reality. In our world, the cascading consequences of the first major incident would likely prevent the company from reaching the point where subsequent incidents could occur. The system is designed imperfectly but earnestly to stop dangerous operations before they can harm more people. And it's also worth examining incidents that involved cover-up attempts, because these offer the closest parallels to what seems to happen in the FNAF lore. While the specific details are beyond what we can fully explore here, various companies throughout history have attempted to conceal safety problems, hide incident reports, or mislead investigators about what they knew and when they knew it. These attempts almost universally fail eventually and result in far more severe consequences than if the company had been forthcoming from the beginning. Obstruction of investigations, evidence tampering, and misleading regulators are serious crimes that can result in criminal charges against corporate officers, not just civil liability for the company. The legal concept of willful negligence or reckless disregard becomes relevant when companies continue dangerous operations after being aware of risks. If discovery in litigation revealed that Fazbear Entertainment knew their animatronics posed bite risks, had previous incidents, and failed to implement adequate safeguards, the damages would escalate dramatically. Punitive damages, which are intended to punish particularly egregious behavior and deter similar conduct, could dwarf compensatory damages. Corporate officers could face personal liability, and in extreme cases, criminal charges of negligent homicide or manslaughter might be pursued. The real-world examples we've examined demonstrate that our society has built a complex system for responding to safety failures at entertainment venues, and this system includes regulatory oversight, legal liability, insurance requirements, media scrutiny, and public accountability. While imperfect, it generally succeeds in forcing dangerous operations to either improve dramatically or shut down. A Fazbear Entertainment experiencing the events shown in the games would encounter this system's full force, and the likely outcome would be rapid closure rather than decades of continued operation with modified procedures. This reality doesn't diminish the games as entertainment, but it does highlight how the fiction requires accepting premises that wouldn't hold in our world. The horror of FNAF partly depends on these businesses continuing to exist despite catastrophic failures, on night guards being alone with dangerous equipment, on evidence being suppressed, on patterns being overlooked. These elements work wonderfully for gameplay and atmosphere, but they diverge significantly from how entertainment venue incidents actually unfold in jurisdictions with modern safety frameworks. Understanding this difference enriches our appreciation of both the games and the real systems that protect us in our timeline. Missing children. The reality of investigation and response. The most horrifying element of the Five Nights at Freddy storyline isn't the malfunctioning animatronics or the spring lock failures. It's the missing children, those young victims who vanished from within the pizzeria and whose fates define the series' darkest turns. To understand what would really happen if children disappeared from a real Fazbear Entertainment, we need to examine how missing children cases are actually investigated, what resources activate, and how dramatically different the response would be from what the games depict. In the FNAF timeline, the missing children incident of 1985 involves 5 children vanishing from a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, with investigations seemingly occurring but not leading to conclusive prosecution, allowing the company to continue operating and the killer to remain at large. This scenario would be profoundly different in our reality because of the robust, multi-layered response system that activates when children go missing, especially when multiple children disappear from a single location. Let's examine how this system actually functions. The moment a child is reported missing, especially a young child from a public place, law enforcement response is immediate and comprehensive. And there's a persistent myth that police require 24 hours to pass before taking a missing person report, but this is entirely false, particularly for children. The FBI's Violent Crimes Against Children program makes clear that any mysterious disappearance of a child, especially a child of tender years, generally defined as 12 or younger, triggers immediate investigation with no waiting period and no requirement for evidence of interstate travel. When that initial report comes in that a child has vanished from a Chuck E. Cheese or similar venue, which is the real-world equivalent of a Fazbear location, the response escalates rapidly. Local police dispatch units immediately to begin searching the premises and surrounding area. They interview staff, review security footage, identify potential witnesses, and secure the scene. And the facility would be locked down, preventing anyone from leaving until they've been interviewed and their information recorded. This initial response happens within minutes, not hours or days. Simultaneously, the case gets entered into the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, database, which is accessible to law enforcement agencies nationwide. This ensures that if the child is spotted anywhere in the country, authorities will be immediately alerted. the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, is notified and begins working to support the search through public awareness campaigns, distribution of the child's photo and description, and coordination with media outlets. Amber alerts may be issued if the circumstances meet specific criteria, broadcasting information about the missing child across television, radio, in highway signs, and mobile devices throughout the region. If the child isn't located quickly through these initial efforts, or if there's any indication of abduction by a stranger rather than a runaway or family abduction situation, the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment, CARD, teams deploy to the scene. These are specialized teams of FBI agents trained specifically in child abduction cases, who can arrive within an hour or two to augment local resources. They bring sophisticated investigative techniques, access to national databases, behavioral analysis expertise, and technical assets that small local departments might not possess. CARD teams have deployed more than 200 times since their creation in 2006, assisting in approximately 108 cases with victims both domestic and international. The CARD team's response is comprehensive and systematic. They establish an on-site command post to centralize the investigation. They map registered sex offenders in the area and conduct checks on individuals with relevant criminal histories. They guide the investigation using established protocols from the FBI's Child Abduction Response Plan. They coordinate forensic resources, including FBI laboratory services if physical evidence needs analysis. They manage leads coming in from across the country. And critically, they bring specialized interview techniques designed to get information from potential witnesses, including children who might have seen something but struggle to articulate it. Now imagine this response activating not for one child, but for multiple children vanishing from the same location on the same day, which is what happens in the FNAF law. Based on established patterns in law enforcement response to mass incidents, this would immediately elevate the case to one of national significance. Multiple simultaneous abductions from a single location by definition indicates a planned attack rather than an opportunistic incident. Every resource at every level would mobilize. FBI headquarters in Washington would be directly involved. The State Attorney General's office would likely assign senior prosecutors to work with investigators in real time. The governor might make public statements and commit state resources. Media coverage would be enormous and sustained. The pizzeria would become an active crime scene, sealed by law enforcement and subjected to extraordinarily thorough processing. Forensic teams would document every inch of the facility. They would collect DNA evidence from any surfaces the children might have touched. They would review all security footage, not just from that day, but going back weeks or months to look for suspicious patterns. They would interview every employee, every customer who was present, every delivery driver, everyone who had been on the premises recently. They would check backgrounds on all staff members and look for any criminal histories or concerning behavior. The security guard would obviously be a person of interest, not because there's any reason to suspect them specifically, but because they had access to the facility and were present during the time frame in question. This person would be extensively interviewed, likely multiple times. Their background would be thoroughly investigated. Their financial records, communications, and social media would be scrutinized for anything suspicious. This isn't harassment. It's standard investigatory procedure when serious crimes occur. Any employee or frequent visitor to the location would receive similar attention. Crucially, the business would not be allowed to simply reopen after a brief closure. The facility would remain secured as an active crime scene for as long as investigators needed, potentially weeks or even months. Once law enforcement released the scene, the company would still face massive hurdles to reopening. They would need to address whatever security failures allowed the abductions to occur. Insurance might not cover continued operations given the incident. Local government might revoke operating permits. And practically speaking, no parents would bring their children to a location where multiple kids had recently vanished. The business viability of that specific location would be destroyed. The investigation would pursue multiple parallel tracks. Detectives would create detailed timelines of each child's movements that day. They would identify and interview everyone who interacted with the victims. They would examine the possibility that someone targeted these specific children versus randomly selecting victims of opportunity. They would investigate whether staff members might have been involved or negligent. They would search nearby areas extensively using cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and other tools. If there's suspicion, the children might have been killed on or near the premises. FBI behavioral analysts would develop profiles of the likely perpetrator based on the circumstances of the abductions. These profiles help focus the investigation by identifying characteristics the offender probably possesses. If evidence suggested the children were taken by someone familiar with the facility, analysts might determine this person likely had legitimate access, possibly as an employee or contractor. This would direct investigators to look closely at anyone who worked there, especially anyone who might have left employment shortly before or after the incidents. Digital forensics would play a major role. Investigators would examine all electronic devices on the premises, looking for evidence of planning or communication. They would obtain search warrants for staff computers and phones. They would review social media posts and online activity for anyone connected to the case. Modern investigations leave digital trails that are increasingly difficult to conceal, and analysts are trained to find evidence even when attempts have been made to delete it. As the investigation progressed without quickly finding the children, the family support aspect would become increasingly important. FBI victim specialists, who are not special agents but rather professionals trained in trauma and crisis intervention, would work closely with the families. They would provide resources, coordinate support services, manage communication between investigators and families, and help navigate the overwhelming experience of having a child go missing. And this support continues not just during the active investigation, but potentially for years afterward if the children aren't recovered. If bodies were eventually discovered, as happens in some missing children cases, the investigation shifts to a homicide case while maintaining the child abduction elements. This brings additional resources and expertise. Forensic pathologists conduct autopsies to determine cause and time of death. Evidence from the bodies is processed for DNA, trace evidence, anything that might identify the killer. The location where bodies are found becomes a secondary crime scene, processed with the same thoroughness as the abduction site. Every piece of information helps build a case that can be prosecuted successfully. The legal proceedings that would follow successful identification of a suspect would be extensive and public. Charges would likely include multiple counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and potentially other crimes depending on circumstances. Because child murder cases generate enormous public attention and outrage, prosecutors would dedicate significant resources to ensuring a successful conviction. The trial would receive extensive media coverage. The evidence would be presented in meticulous detail, and if convicted, the defendant would face the maximum available penalties, potentially including the death penalty in states that retain capital punishment. Parallel to the criminal case, civil litigation would proceed. Families would likely sue Fazbear Entertainment for wrongful death, arguing that inadequate security and negligent operations created conditions that allowed the abductions to occur. Discovery in these civil cases would expose internal company communications, security protocols, previous incidents, and decisions made about safety measures. Often, civil litigation reveals information that wasn't admissible in criminal trials, leading to additional public understanding of what happened and why. The NCMEC would maintain active files on all the victims indefinitely. They would create age-progressed photos, showing what the children might look like years later, in case they were alive somewhere. They would publicize the cases on their website and through media partnerships. They would coordinate with law enforcement on any new leads, as this sustained attention keeps cold cases from being forgotten, and sometimes leads to breakthroughs years or decades after the initial incidents. Now let's contrast all of this with what happens in the Five Nights at Freddy's timeline. In the games, the missing children incident occurs. Some investigation apparently happens, but then Fazbear Entertainment continues operating various locations across subsequent years. The suspect, William Afton, apparently isn't conclusively identified and prosecuted during the initial investigation. Multiple locations experience problems, but the pattern doesn't trigger the kind of overwhelming multi-agency response that would occur in reality. This divergence is necessary for the game's narrative, but it's important to understand how impossible this would be in our timeline. A real missing children case involving multiple victims from a single location would become one of the most heavily investigated crimes in that jurisdiction's history. The FBI would maintain active involvement for years. The local community would be deeply affected, with the case becoming a defining event in local memory. National media would periodically revisit it, especially on anniversaries or when new developments occurred. True crime documentaries would examine it. The location where it happened would likely never operate as an entertainment venue again, potentially being demolished or dramatically repurposed. If the perpetrator was ever identified, even years later, the prosecution would proceed vigorously. Advances in forensic science have allowed cold cases from decades past to be solved through new DNA analysis techniques, our genealogical databases, and other methods that weren't available when the crimes occurred. Cases from the 1980s and earlier are being solved now in 2025 because of these advances. A Fazbear-style case from 1985 would absolutely remain active, with investigators periodically reviewing evidence and pursuing new leads. The community impact of such a case would be profound and lasting. Parents who lived in the area during the incidents would tell their children about it years later. The case would be referenced in local history. Memorials might be established for the victims. The idea that people would simply forget or move on, while Fazbear Entertainment continued operating pizzerias in the same community, is not realistic. The horror and loss from such an event would cast a shadow across decades, affecting how that community thought about child safety, how they supervised children in public places, and what businesses they would or wouldn't support. It's also worth noting that approximately 90% of missing children cases reported to NCMEC are resolved, which is a remarkably high rate that reflects the effectiveness of the response system. Most missing children are runaways who return, or family abduction cases that are resolved through legal channels. The cases involving stranger abductions, especially of young children, represent a small percentage of all missing children reports, but these receive the most intensive response precisely because time is so critical. Statistics show that children abducted for sexual assault are usually assaulted within minutes of the abduction, and historically, in cases where abducted children are murdered, 74% are killed within 3 hours and 90% within 24 hours. These sobering statistics drive the urgency of the response. This intensive system exists because our society has learned through tragic experience that children require special protection and that responding quickly and comprehensively to abductions saves lives. The protocols, the resources, the multi-agency coordination, all of it developed over decades in response to specific cases that taught painful lessons. The system isn't perfect, cold cases still exist, children are still victimized, but the response is vastly more robust than what seems to occur in the FNAF timeline. Understanding how the real system works helps us appreciate both its strengths and the ways fiction necessarily deviates from reality to tell certain types of stories. The supernatural element. How society responds to claims of hauntings. One of the defining elements of Five Nights at Freddy's that distinguishes it from a straightforward thriller about corporate negligence is the supernatural possession of the animatronics by the spirits of the murdered children. This element raises an interesting question. How would real-world authorities, media, and society respond if people began reporting that animatronics at a specific location were behaving in ways that couldn't be explained by mechanical malfunction, and instead seemed to indicate haunting or possession? To explore this, we need to understand how our society currently handles claims of paranormal activity, supernatural phenomena, and purportedly haunted locations. The response is complicated because it involves a tension between scientific skepticism, religious or spiritual beliefs, entertainment value, and genuine attempts to understand unusual experiences that people report. In our current cultural moment, belief in ghosts and paranormal phenomena is actually quite widespread. Various polls have found that between 45 and 55% of Americans report believing in ghosts, and a significant percentage claim to have experienced something they considered supernatural. This belief exists across different educational levels, socioeconomic groups, and religious backgrounds, though the interpretation of these experiences varies greatly, and some view them through a religious lens as spirits or demons, others through a more secular paranormal framework, and still others as psychological phenomena or misinterpreted natural events. When locations become known for alleged hauntings, several predictable patterns emerge. First, the claims tend to attract attention from paranormal investigation groups, which have proliferated significantly since the early 2000s, partly due to television shows popularizing ghost hunting. These groups typically use various equipment like electromagnetic field meters, thermal cameras, and audio recorders, attempting to document supernatural activity. Their findings are almost universally disputed by scientific skeptics, as the equipment they use doesn't actually detect ghosts by any validated measure, but rather environmental factors that could have many mundane explanations. Second, media coverage follows, especially local news stations that often run Halloween season stories about supposedly haunted locations. These stories typically present the claims uncritically as entertainment, rather than serious investigations of the supernatural. They interview people who report experiencing unusual phenomena, show atmospheric footage of the location, and generally treat the topic as a curiosity rather than something requiring rigorous analysis. Third, if the location is accessible, it may attract tourists interested in the paranormal. Entire businesses have developed around supposedly haunted locations offering ghost tours, overnight stays, or investigation experiences. These ventures exist in a grey area where operators simultaneously claim their locations are genuinely haunted while marketing them as entertainment, leaving the question of belief up to individual visitors. Now, let's apply this framework to a Fazbear entertainment scenario. Suppose after the missing children incident, reports began circulating that the animatronics were behaving strangely. Night guards claimed they moved without power. Families reported creepy experiences during visits. Former employees described unsettling encounters. Drawing from patterns in how institutions handle paranormal claims, how would this unfold? Initially, if any night guard reported to authorities that animatronics were moving on their own, walking through the building, or acting independently, the response would be dismissive, but not entirely ignoring their concerns. Based on standard law enforcement protocols, authorities would likely check whether someone was entering the building illegally, whether the security guard was intoxicated or otherwise impaired, or whether there were mechanical explanations for the reported movements. If multiple people reported similar experiences, investigators might become more interested, but their focus would remain on rational explanations. Was someone breaking in to vandalize or steal? Were the animatronics on a delayed timer? Was there a wiring issue causing erratic behavior? The company's response would depend on their assessment of the situation. If the reports could be dismissed as a single person's imagination or misperception, they might simply ignore them. If multiple credible witnesses reported the same phenomena, the company would likely bring in engineers to examine the equipment. They would be looking for technical problems, short circuits, software glitches, power supply issues, anything that could cause unexpected activation. The possibility that the animatronics were actually possessed by spirits wouldn't factor into their troubleshooting, because that's not within the realm of conventional engineering solutions. If the technical examination found no problems, or if unusual behaviors persisted despite repairs, the company would face a decision. They could continue denying anything unusual was happening, which risks negative publicity if employees keep reporting incidents. They could lean into the haunting angle as a marketing opportunity, potentially drawing customers interested in the paranormal. Or they could simply retire the problematic animatronics and replace them with new ones, which would be the most practical response. The marketing angle is worth exploring because it has real-world precedents. Some restaurants and entertainment venues have successfully marketed themselves as haunted, using the reputation to attract customers rather than repel them. This works best when the haunting claims are ambiguous enough to be spooky without being genuinely threatening. A family pizzeria probably couldn't successfully market itself as haunted by murdered children's spirits. That's too dark for their target demographic. But if the claims were more vague, mysterious movements or strange occurrences without clear connection to tragedy, they might generate curiosity. Religious communities would have varied responses to haunting claims. Some Christian groups would likely interpret the phenomena as demonic activity rather than actual ghosts of children. As many Christian theological frameworks don't include ghosts in the traditional sense, but do acknowledge demons and spiritual warfare. They might attempt blessings or exorcisms of the location. Other religious traditions have different frameworks for understanding spirits and might offer their own interpretations and interventions. Secular skeptics would dismiss the entire premise as superstition and attribute any unusual experiences to mechanical problems, psychological factors, or deliberate hoaxes. If the haunting claims receive significant publicity, paranormal investigation groups would absolutely want access to investigate. They would bring their equipment, spend nights in the location, and likely report findings of electromagnetic anomalies, electronic voice phenomena, temperature fluctuations, or other data they interpret as evidence of spirits. These findings would then be promoted through their websites, social media, and potentially paranormal television shows. However, scientific examination of their methodology consistently shows that their equipment doesn't actually detect supernatural phenomena, but rather normal environmental variations that they misinterpret, or that can be explained through conventional physics and psychology. One psychological factor worth understanding is how expectation and suggestion influence perception. When people enter a location believing it to be haunted, they become hypervigilant for unusual sensory experiences, and normal background noises, shadows from moving lights, or other mundane occurrences become interpreted through a paranormal framework. This doesn't mean people are lying about their experiences, but rather that human perception is profoundly influenced by expectation and context. In a dimly lit pizzeria with animatronic figures that look eerie even when inactive, and with knowledge of the location's tragic history, people would be primed to interpret ambiguous stimuli as ghostly activity. From a legal standpoint, haunting claims create interesting challenges. If a business became known as haunted and customers were frightened or claimed to be harmed by paranormal activity, could they sue? Generally, courts don't recognize supernatural causes as creating liability, and if an animatronic that wasn't supposed to be active suddenly moved and frightened a customer who then fell and was injured, the company would be liable for the physical injury resulting from equipment malfunction. But the customer couldn't successfully argue that a ghost caused the movement, and that the company should have known they needed a spiritual cleansing rather than equipment maintenance. There are also disclosure requirements in some jurisdictions about property history when selling real estate. Some states require sellers to disclose if a property is reportedly haunted or has a stigmatized history involving deaths. This varies significantly by location and interpretation. A Fazbear Entertainment trying to sell a location with a history of missing children and haunting claims would face challenges finding buyers, regardless of whether the paranormal claims had any merit, simply because the property would carry stigma that could affect its value and viability. The most realistic outcome of widespread haunting claims at a Fazbear location would probably be a combination of factors. Based on historical patterns of how businesses handle reputation issues, some people would become more interested in visiting out of curiosity. Others would avoid it entirely. Media coverage would alternate between credulous local news segments and skeptical debunking. Paranormal investigators would proclaim it one of the most haunted locations they've studied. Scientific skeptics would explain the reports through mechanical issues and psychological factors. And the company would likely eventually close the location, not because they believed it was haunted, but because the controversy would make it difficult to operate profitably, regardless of the truth of the paranormal claims. It's important to note that while genuine belief in the supernatural is widespread, institutional response is almost entirely grounded in naturalistic explanations. Police don't conduct ghost investigations. Courts don't recognize supernatural causation. Insurance companies don't cover paranormal damage. Regulatory agencies don't inspect for spiritual contamination. The entire framework of modern society operates on the assumption that natural explanations exist for phenomena, even if we haven't yet identified them in specific cases. This means that however employees or customers perceive the animatronic's behavior, the institutional response would focus on mechanical causes, human tampering, or psychological factors. This creates an interesting disconnect between the FNAF narrative and what would happen in reality. The games present a world where the supernatural possession is real, and characters like Henry and Michael eventually come to understand and respond to this reality. But in our world, even if supernatural possession were somehow real, the systems we've built to handle problems would struggle to acknowledge or address it because they're designed around physical, observable, testable phenomena. A possessed animatronic in our reality would most likely get examined by engineers who would find whatever mechanical issues it had, or if it appeared to function normally during testing, would label the reports as mistaken perceptions or attempts to create viral stories. The tension between belief and institutional reality shapes how haunting claims affect businesses and communities. A location can simultaneously be dismissed by authorities as having no legitimate paranormal activity, while being avoided by much of the community because of its reputation. The truth or falseness of the supernatural claims becomes almost secondary to the social reality that the location is now known as haunted, which affects its viability regardless. This social dimension would be one of the most significant impacts on a real Fazbear Entertainment facing such claims. The corporate cover-up, real-world parallels to Fazbear Entertainment. One of the recurring elements in the Five Nights at Freddy's lore is the implication that Fazbear Entertainment has engaged in systematic cover-ups of incidents, destruction of evidence, and concealment of dangerous conditions. To understand whether this is realistic, we need to examine how corporate cover-ups actually function in our world, what motivates them, how they're discovered, and what consequences result when they're exposed. The history of American business includes numerous examples that offer sobering parallels to the fictional Fazbear Entertainment. Corporate malfeasance in response to safety concerns follows predictable patterns. When a company discovers a defect in their product or a safety issue with their operations that could result in liability, they face a critical decision point. The ethical and legally appropriate response is to immediately address the problem, recall defective products, fix safety issues, notify potentially affected customers or employees, and cooperate with any regulatory investigations. However, this response can be expensive, damaging to reputation, and potentially admission of liability that invites lawsuits. This creates a perverse incentive for companies, especially those in financial distress, to instead conceal the problem and hope it doesn't lead to further incidents. One of the most infamous examples is the Ford Pinto case from the 1970s. Ford discovered through internal testing that the Pinto's fuel tank design was vulnerable to rupturing in rear-end collisions, which could cause fires. Engineering changes could have addressed this flaw for a modest cost per vehicle. However, Ford conducted a cost-benefit analysis comparing the expense of the recall versus the likely payout from lawsuits if people died in fires caused by the design flaw. Their analysis, which became public during litigation, coldly calculated that it would be cheaper to pay settlements than fix the cars. This callous decision led to deaths and injuries that could have been prevented, and when exposed, resulted in massive public backlash, enormous punitive damages, and permanent damage to Ford's reputation. The Pinto case established important legal precedents. Courts ruled that knowingly maintaining a dangerous design and concealing it from consumers could justify punitive damages far exceeding actual compensatory damages. The internal documents showing Ford's cost-benefit analysis were particularly damaging because they demonstrated willful disregard for safety. This case taught subsequent companies that cover-ups are more likely to be uncovered than successful, and the consequences of exposure are typically far worse than proactive disclosure would have been. Another relevant case involves General Motors and the ignition switch defect that killed at least 124 people over more than a decade. GM engineers knew about the defect, which could cause engines to shut off while driving and disable power steering, brakes, and airbags. However, the company didn't recall vehicles because they wanted to avoid the cost and negative publicity. Internal emails revealed that executives discussed the problem but decided against action. When the cover-up was eventually exposed in 2014, GM faced criminal charges, paid massive fines, created a compensation fund for victims, and suffered severe reputation damage. Senior executives lost their jobs. The Justice Department and Congress investigated. The case demonstrated that large corporations with substantial legal resources still face serious consequences when cover-ups are revealed. The pharmaceutical industry has also seen significant cover-up scandals. Purdue Pharma aggressively marketed OxyContin while downplaying its addiction risks, contributing to the opioid epidemic. When litigation exposed internal documents showing the company knew the drug was being widely abused but continued marketing it, the result was billions in settlements, bankruptcy of the company, and criminal charges against executives. The tobacco industry's decades-long campaign to conceal the health risks of smoking, despite internal research confirming those risks, ultimately resulted in a master settlement agreement requiring payment of billions of dollars in perpetuity, restrictions on marketing, and public release of internal documents showing the cover-up. These cases establish several principles relevant to our Fazbear Entertainment hypothetical. First, corporations facing potential liability from safety issues sometimes do attempt cover-ups rather than proactive remediation. Second, these cover-ups almost always eventually get exposed, typically through litigation discovery, whistleblowers, investigative journalism, or regulatory investigation. Third, the consequences of cover-ups are generally far more severe than the consequences of the original problem would have been if handled appropriately. Fourth, individual executives can face personal liability, not just the corporation. And in the Five Nights at Freddy's timeline, Fazbear Entertainment experiences multiple serious incidents across years and locations, but apparently continues operating through various business iterations. They hide bodies, seal off safe rooms, destroy evidence, and generally attempt to conceal their problems rather than addressing them. In reality, this approach would face multiple obstacles. First is the whistleblower problem. Companies that engage in cover-ups of serious safety issues rarely achieve unanimous silence from their employees. Someone who was present during the incidents, who helped hide evidence, or who later discovered what happened, would likely feel moral obligation or face legal pressure to disclose what they knew. Federal and state whistleblower protection laws provide legal safeguards for employees who report corporate wrongdoing, and financial incentives exist for whistleblowers in certain types of cases. The Dodd-Frank Act, for example, provides monetary rewards for whistleblowers who provide information leading to successful enforcement actions in securities fraud cases. Modern whistleblowers have numerous channels for disclosure. They can contact regulatory agencies anonymously. They can provide information to journalists who are often eager to investigate corporate wrongdoing. They can retain attorneys and negotiate disclosures in exchange for immunity. They can post information online. The idea that a restaurant chain could have multiple employees aware of serious incidents, including possible murders and evidence concealment, and none of them would break silence, is difficult to believe in our contemporary context. Second is the forensic problem. Modern investigative techniques make comprehensive cover-ups increasingly difficult. Security camera footage may be stored in cloud backups that can't be easily destroyed. Electronic communications leave digital trails that forensic analysts can recover even after deletion attempts. Credit card transactions, phone records, and other data create patterns that investigators can analyze. Even physical evidence is harder to completely eliminate than people often believe. Crime scene investigators using luminol can detect blood that's been cleaned. DNA analysis can identify victims and suspects from minute samples. Fiber analysis, fingerprints, and other forensic techniques continue advancing. If children vanished from a Fazbear Entertainment location and the company attempted to cover this up, investigators would approach the case with deep suspicion of the business. They would obtain search warrants for all records, both physical and electronic. They would interview employees separately and look for inconsistencies in their accounts. They would examine financial records for unusual transactions that might indicate payments for silence. They would check personnel records to see if any employees were fired or left shortly after the incidents. They would analyze phone and email communications for any discussion of the events. Third is the regulatory framework problem. Depending on the state, various agencies have jurisdiction over different aspects of family entertainment center operations. When health departments inspect food service, building departments enforce codes, fire marshals ensure safety compliance. If animatronic attractions fall under amusement ride regulations, dedicated inspectors examine them. Each of these agencies creates opportunities for problems to be discovered. An inspector noticing damage to animatronics that looks like it might have involved stuffing something inside would ask questions. A health inspector finding evidence of biological contamination would investigate its source. Multiple agency oversight creates redundancy that makes comprehensive cover-ups harder to maintain. Fourth is the legal discovery problem. Once civil lawsuits are filed, which would certainly happen after children vanished or were harmed, the discovery process gives plaintiff attorneys powerful tools to uncover evidence. They can subpoena documents the company doesn't want to produce. They can depose employees under oath, where lying constitutes perjury. They can hire expert witnesses to examine equipment and identify what really happened. They can request electronic discovery that includes not just current documents, but also deleted files that can be forensically recovered. Companies that attempt to conceal evidence during litigation face sanctions, contempt charges, and adverse inference instructions, where juries are told to assume the destroyed evidence would have been unfavorable to the company. The Sony rootkit scandal offers an interesting parallel. In the mid-2000s, Sony secretly installed rootkit software on music CDs that created security vulnerabilities on users' computers, or attempting to implement digital rights management without disclosure. When security researchers discovered this, the revelation led to widespread outrage, class action lawsuits, settlements costing Sony millions, and regulatory fines. Sony's attempt to conceal what they were doing made the consequences far worse than if they had been transparent initially. The cover-up attempt itself became part of the scandal. More recently, the Volkswagen emissions scandal demonstrated how even sophisticated corporations with substantial resources struggle with cover-ups in the modern era. Volkswagen installed software in millions of diesel vehicles to cheat on emissions tests, concealing that the vehicles actually produced far more pollution than allowed. When the deception was discovered in 2015, and the consequences were catastrophic, billions in fines and settlements, criminal charges against executives, forced recalls, and massive reputational damage. Despite Volkswagen's technical sophistication and resources, they couldn't maintain the deception indefinitely. These real-world cases establish that while corporations sometimes attempt to conceal safety issues and wrongdoing, these attempts face serious obstacles in contemporary society and generally result in far worse outcomes than transparency would have produced. A mid-tier restaurant chain like Fazbear Entertainment would have even more difficulty maintaining a cover-up than major corporations like Ford, GM, Sony, or Volkswagen, because they'd have fewer resources, less sophisticated legal support, and more pressure from immediate financial problems. There's also the question of individual moral responsibility. Corporate cover-ups require multiple people to either actively participate in concealment or passively accept it through silence. While corporate culture can sometimes normalize unethical behavior, individuals still face personal moral reckoning and legal jeopardy. A technician asked to help hide evidence that children died in animatronics would face a profound ethical dilemma. Cooperating would make them criminally complicit in covering up deaths. Refusing might cost their job, but would preserve their integrity and avoid legal liability. Most people, when faced with this stark choice, choose not to participate in serious crimes, especially crimes involving children. The legal consequences for individuals who participate in corporate cover-ups have become increasingly severe. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act and other corporate governance reforms strengthened personal accountability for executives. Obstruction of justice is a serious federal crime carrying significant prison time. Depending on the specific actions, individuals might face charges of evidence tampering, obstruction, conspiracy, accessory after the fact to murder, or other crimes. The risk of personal imprisonment creates strong incentive for individuals to cooperate with investigations rather than maintain corporate secrecy. If we imagine a realistic scenario where Fazbear Entertainment tried to cover up incidents, what would likely happen? Initially, some employees might be convinced or pressured into silence. Management might destroy or conceal certain documents. They might give misleading statements to investigators, but as pressure mounted from law enforcement, regulators, and plaintiff attorneys, historical patterns suggest cracks would appear in the cover-up. An employee would provide information to investigators. Forensic analysis would uncover evidence of concealment. Discovery and litigation would reveal internal communications discussing the incidents. Eventually, the full truth would emerge, and those involved in the cover-up would face consequences more severe than if they'd been forthcoming from the beginning. The FNAF narrative requires accepting that Fazbear Entertainment successfully maintains cover-ups across decades and multiple incidents. This works for the fiction and creates an atmosphere of corporate callousness and institutional failure that enhances the horror. But in reality, and such sustained deception would be extraordinarily difficult given our current legal framework, investigative techniques, media environment, and the basic human tendency of some people to tell the truth when confronted with serious wrongdoing, especially involving children. The systems we've built aren't perfect, but they've been deliberately designed through hard experience to make cover-ups difficult, risky, and ultimately more costly than transparency. Night security. The actual experience of working alone at night. The night security guard position is central to the Five Nights at Freddy's games, serving as the player's avatar and explaining why someone would be alone in the building when the animatronics become active. To understand whether this setup is realistic, we need to examine what security work is actually like, particularly night shifts at relatively low-profile commercial locations like a family entertainment restaurant. The first important point is that many small to mid-sized businesses don't employ dedicated security guards at all. especially overnight. When we're talking about a pizzeria or family entertainment center, rather than a bank, hospital, or industrial facility, the more common approach is to simply lock the building when closing and rely on alarm systems monitored by external companies. If the alarm is triggered, the monitoring company contacts the business owner and local police rather than having anyone on site to respond. This arrangement is much more cost-effective than paying a security guard to sit in the building all night. For businesses that do employ night security, several models exist. Some use proprietary security, meaning guards employed directly by the company. Others contract with security service companies that provide guards who work for the security firm, rather than the business they're protecting. The contract model is more common for smaller businesses because it shifts the administrative burden of employment to the security company and provides flexibility to adjust coverage as needed. The trade-off is that contract security guards are often paid less, receive less training, and have less investment in the specific client's needs than proprietary guards would. Security work, especially night shifts at low-activity locations, is a notoriously difficult job for reasons that are both obvious and subtle. The most immediate challenge is simply staying awake and alert during hours when human biology strongly promotes sleep. Our circadian rhythms are powerful, evolved over millions of years to sync our activity with daylight and our sleep with darkness. Working against this natural rhythm creates significant physiological stress that affects both short-term functioning and long-term health. Research on shift workers, including security guards, documents extensive health impacts. Studies have found that night shift work disrupts the hypothalamic, pituitary adrenal axis and sympathetic nervous system, leading to altered cortisol levels and elevated stress responses. The International Agency for Research on Cancer has classified shift work involving circadian disruption as probably carcinogenic, based on evidence that it increases cancer risk. Night shift workers show higher rates of cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders including diabetes, obesity, gastrointestinal problems, and mental health issues including depression and anxiety. Beyond these long-term health effects, the immediate challenge is cognitive impairment from sleep deprivation and circadian disruption. Guards working nights often experience reduced concentration, slower reaction times, impaired decision-making, and micro-sleeps, brief moments where the brain essentially shuts off for seconds at a time. These impairments are dangerous in any security context, but especially so if the job involves responding to emergencies or operating equipment. The psychological challenges are equally significant. Night shift security work is often profoundly isolating. Guards may work entirely alone, sometimes in large buildings where they're the only person present. They may go entire shifts without meaningful human interaction, and this isolation, combined with the unusual hours that make normal social life difficult, contributes to feelings of loneliness and disconnection. Security guards often work when everyone they know is sleeping, sleep when everyone else is active, and find it difficult to maintain friendships, participate in family activities, or engage in normal social rhythms. The nature of the work itself creates unique stresses. Security guards are expected to remain vigilant for rare events. The vast majority of nights, nothing unusual happens. This creates a paradox. Guards must maintain a state of readiness for situations that almost never occur. The combination of high vigilance requirements with low stimulus environments is extremely taxing psychologically. Boredom becomes a serious problem, but guards can't simply zone out. because the rare occasions when something does happen require immediate, effective response. When security guards do encounter situations requiring intervention, they often face them alone with limited backup. Unlike police officers who typically have partners and can quickly summon additional officers, security guards may be the only responder available until police arrive, which could take minutes or longer depending on location. This creates significant stress, especially when dealing with potentially violent individuals, medical emergencies, or other crises. Guards receive varying levels of training in de-escalation, emergency response, and physical intervention, but many have only basic training before being placed in situations where these skills are needed. The compensation for security work, and particularly for contract guards at commercial locations, is typically quite low. Many security positions pay at or slightly above minimum wage. This creates a difficult dynamic where the demands of the job, the health impacts, and the responsibility are substantial, but the financial compensation doesn't reflect those challenges. This leads to high turnover in the industry, which then creates further problems because experienced guards leave for better opportunities and are replaced by inexperienced workers who need training. Now let's apply this understanding to the Five Nights at Freddy's scenario. Would a pizzeria employ a dedicated night security guard? Possibly, but not certainly. If they did, it would likely be a contract position through a security company rather than direct employment, and the guard would probably be paid around $15 to $20 per hour in current dollars. Definitely not enough to justify the risks suggested by the game's premise. They would receive minimal training, probably just basic orientation on building layout, alarm systems, camera locations, and emergency contacts. The setup shown in the games, with the guard sitting in a small office monitoring cameras and using doors and lights, mixes realistic and unrealistic elements. Security guards do monitor camera systems, and many guard positions involve remaining primarily in one location rather than constantly patrolling. However, the resource limitation aspect, running out of power before the shift ends, is entirely fictional. Real security systems have backup power supplies, and the guard isn't rationing a finite amount of electricity through the night. If the power failed, backup systems would activate, and the guard would contact maintenance and their supervisor. The psychological experience of working night security at a location with a disturbing history would be uniquely challenging. Even without any supernatural elements, knowing that children had vanished or died at the location would create significant anxiety. Every unusual noise, every shadow glimpsed on a monitor, every technical glitch with the cameras or equipment would trigger heightened alertness and fear responses. This kind of chronic low-level fear is exhausting and can lead to hypervigilance, a state where the nervous system remains constantly activated in anticipation of threats. The security guards working in such conditions often report various coping mechanisms. Some try to normalize the situation through humor or deliberately avoiding thinking about disturbing aspects of their workplace. Others remain hypervigilant, exhausting themselves through the shift. Some engage in distracting activities like reading, studying, or using their phones, though this conflicts with their surveillance responsibilities. The optimal state, relaxed alertness, where the guard is attentive but not anxious, is difficult to maintain, especially across multiple consecutive night shifts. If animatronics were actually moving around the building at night in ways they shouldn't, a real security guard's response would differ significantly from what the games depict. Rather than trying to survive until 6 a.m., a rational behavioral pattern suggests a guard would contact their supervisor and possibly police immediately upon observing equipment operating anomalously. They would document what they were seeing with camera footage or their phone. They would probably evacuate the building rather than remaining in the office. Looking at documented security industry practices and workplace safety standards, no reasonable person would accept the premise that it's normal for animatronics to wander around trying to access the security office, and that the guard's job is just to keep them out until dawn. This highlights a fundamental tension between the game mechanics and reality. The games need the player to stay in the location and manage limited resources while defending against animatronic attacks. This creates compelling gameplay. But in reality, is if someone working security observed the kinds of behaviors the animatronics display, the appropriate response would be to leave immediately and call for help, not to remain in place attempting to survive the night. The guard has no obligation to remain in a building with malfunctioning equipment that poses serious danger. In fact, workplace safety law would support the guard's right to refuse to work in immediately dangerous conditions. The aftermath of such a night would be significant. The guard would file an incident report with their employer, the security company, and possibly OSHA. The building owner would be notified. Equipment would be inspected. If the guard suffered any injury, even psychological trauma from the experience, workers' compensation claims might follow. If the guard refused to return to the site, which would be entirely reasonable, the employer would need to find a replacement, or potentially face liability for asking workers to operate in unsafe conditions. Over time, if guards kept reporting the same kinds of unusual experiences, the location would develop a reputation in the security industry as a problematic site. Security companies would demand higher fees to provide guards there, or might refuse the contract altogether. Individual guards would share information about difficult or dangerous posts, and the Fazbear location would become known as a place to avoid. This informal network of security workers sharing information about good and bad sites is very real and affects which locations can easily retain security services. The financial model for security work also differs from what the games suggest. Businesses pay for security services based on factors including hours of coverage, number of guards, special qualifications required, and risk level of the location. A pizzeria with a history of disturbing incidents would be classified as higher risk, increasing the cost of security services. The business would face pressure to either address the underlying problems making security difficult or accept significantly higher costs for coverage. Over time, the economics would push toward either fixing whatever was causing the problems or closing the location. There's also the question of what exactly the guard is protecting against at a closed pizzeria. They're not guarding valuable merchandise or cash, as those would presumably be removed or secured at closing. The building and equipment have insurance, and physical security doesn't prevent all potential damage anyway. The main value of overnight security at such a location would be detecting break-ins, vandalism, or fires early enough to minimize damage. A business owner evaluating whether to employ overnight security would weigh these benefits against the cost. And for many businesses, the math doesn't support it. The realistic scenario is that a pizzeria probably wouldn't have overnight security, or if they did, it would be a bare-bones contract position, where the guard primarily monitors alarm systems and does periodic rounds rather than intensive surveillance. If problems arose, whether animatronic malfunctions or other issues, the business would be pressured to address them rather than expecting guards to tolerate dangerous conditions. And guards who experience the kinds of events shown in the games would quit rather than accept the risk. leaving the business without coverage and forcing them to address the underlying problems or close. Understanding the reality of security work helps us appreciate both what the games get right and where they deliberately depart from reality for gameplay purposes. The isolation, the night shift challenges, the minimal pay for significant responsibility, these elements are authentic. But the expectation that someone would return night after night to a location where they're being hunted by mobile animatronics diverges dramatically from how real workplace dynamics and safety regulations function. The games create a situation where the guard has no choice but to survive until morning, hence which works beautifully for horror gameplay, but wouldn't be sustainable in actual employment relationships or legal frameworks. Families in crisis. The reality of losing a child. Behind every missing child case or tragedy at an entertainment venue are families experiencing unimaginable loss and trauma. To truly understand what would happen if Five Nights at Freddy's came to real life, we must examine what families actually go through when their children vanish or die under suspicious circumstances, how society responds to their grief, and what long-term impacts these experiences create. The immediate aftermath of a child going missing is chaos characterized by terror, disbelief, and desperate hope. When parents realize their child has vanished from a location like a pizzeria, their first responses are frantic searching of the immediate area, asking everyone present if they've seen the child, and then notifying staff or management. Within minutes, assuming the child isn't quickly located, they contact law enforcement. This initial period is marked by adrenaline, fear, and the overwhelming drive to find the child right now. As we discussed earlier in examining investigative procedures, law enforcement response is immediate, but from the family's perspective, even minutes feel like hours. The terror of not knowing where their child is, whether they're safe, whether they're frightened or crying or calling for parents who can't hear them, is overwhelming. Parents describe this period as surreal, as if they're in a nightmare they can't wake from, as the rational part of their mind knows they need to stay calm and help investigators. But the emotional reality is panic that's barely contained. As hours pass without the child being found, families face new waves of devastating realization. The possibility that their child might not be coming home transitions from unthinkable to unavoidable consideration. Different family members may process this at different rates, creating tension. One parent might move toward accepting the worst while the other clings to hope, or siblings might struggle to understand why their parents are so upset. Extended family descends to provide support, but their presence can add to the chaos and emotional intensity. Media attention begins immediately when children go missing, especially in cases involving multiple children. News vans appear at the family's home. Reporters request interviews. Social media explodes with shares of the children's photos and calls for information. While this attention can help locate missing children, it also invades privacy at the worst possible moment. Families describe feeling like their grief is being performed for an audience, that they have to put on brave faces for cameras while internally falling apart. Every statement they make is analyzed. If they don't appear distraught enough, public opinion turns suspicion toward them. If they're too emotional to speak coherently, they're criticized for that too. Financial pressures add to the overwhelming stress. Parents may need to take leave from work indefinitely, creating income loss at the exact moment when expenses spike. They incur costs for travel if they need to support searches in other locations, for accommodation if their home becomes unusable due to media presence or investigative activity, for additional childcare if they have other children who need normal routines maintained. Well-meaning but misguided advice to hire private investigators can drain resources without necessarily helping. Some families find themselves financially devastated by the crisis, even before any funeral costs arise. If and when bodies are recovered, confirming the worst fears that the children died, families transition into a different kind of nightmare. The grief of losing a child is recognized as one of the most difficult traumas humans can experience. It violates the natural order we expect where parents predecease their children, and it creates a permanent void that nothing can fill. The specific horror of knowing your child died violently, perhaps terrified and in pain, adds layers of trauma that survivors carry for life. Grief of this magnitude affects every aspect of existence. Many parents report that their marriages don't survive, not because they blame each other, but because each person's grief is so consuming that they lack capacity to support their partner. Divorce rates are significantly elevated among parents who've lost children. Those marriages that survive often require extensive counseling and conscious commitment to stay together through the impossible. Siblings of lost children also suffer profoundly, are losing their sibling, while also losing their parents' full attention during the crisis, and dealing with complicated survivor guilt about why they lived when their sibling died. The criminal justice process creates its own traumas for families. If suspects are identified and prosecuted, families must endure trials where their children's deaths are discussed in clinical detail. They hear testimony about how their children died. They see evidence photos they can never unsee. Defense attorneys may make arguments that feel like attacks on their children or their parenting. Delays, continuances, appeals, all of it extends the process over years. Even successful convictions don't bring children back, or provide the kind of closure people imagine justice should offer. Civil litigation runs parallel to criminal cases, but with different rules and timelines. Families suing Fazbear Entertainment for wrongful death would face their own challenges. Litigation is expensive, and while attorneys often work on contingency, meaning they're paid from settlements or verdicts rather than upfront, families still incur costs. Depositions require them to relive the events repeatedly. Discovery battles over what evidence gets shared can be frustrating. Defense strategies may include blaming the family for inadequate supervision, suggesting the children bore some responsibility, or presenting character evidence that feels like attacks on the victims. Settlements, when they occur, present complicated emotional terrain. On one hand, a compensation can help with financial devastation and future needs, like mental health treatment. On the other hand, accepting settlement feels to some families like putting a price on their child's life, like moving on when moving on seems impossible. Different family members may disagree about whether to settle or pursue trial. The money itself doesn't heal anything, but its absence creates additional hardship. Long-term, families who've lost children to violence describe their lives as divided into before and after. They talk about learning to carry the loss rather than getting over it, because getting over it isn't possible or even desirable. They find ways to honor their children's memories. Some become advocates, working to prevent similar tragedies for other families. Some establish foundations or scholarships in their children's names. Some become involved in victim services, helping other families navigate what they've survived. These activities provide purpose, but don't eliminate the underlying grief. Families also struggle with what psychologists call disenfranchised grief, when their loss occurred in circumstances that invite public judgment, rather than pure sympathy. If people question why the children were at that location, why parents weren't supervising more closely, or why the family didn't see warning signs. It adds shame to grief. Families may isolate themselves to avoid these judgments, which then increases their suffering through lack of support. Communities vary dramatically in how well they rally around grieving families versus abandoning them to their pain. Anniversaries, birthdays, holidays, all of these become occasions for fresh grief. The child who should be there isn't. The milestones that should be celebrated, graduations, first dates, eventually weddings and grandchildren, all become occasions for mourning what could have been. Over time, families develop rituals for these days that help them through. Some visit grave sites, some hold private memorials, some engage in activities their child enjoyed, but the pain of these moments never completely lessens. In cases involving multiple victims, like the FNAF scenario of 5 children vanishing together, families form complicated relationships with each other. They share unique understanding of what they've survived that no one else possesses. But they also may trigger each other's grief or have conflicts over how the situation should be handled. Some families involved in mass tragedies become close friends who support each other through decades. Others maintain distance because every interaction reminds them of the worst day of their lives. The impact extends to extended family and community as well. Grandparents lose grandchildren and watch their own children suffer without being able to fix it. The children's friends process the loss with their developing emotional capabilities, often struggling to understand death's permanence. Teachers and coaches who knew the children grieve. The entire community where the tragedy occurred feels the weight of what happened. Small communities especially can be defined by such events for generations, with collective trauma that affects how everyone thinks about safety in childhood. Support systems for families vary greatly in quality and availability. Some areas have strong victim services programs that provide counseling, advocacy, and practical assistance. Others offer minimal help. National organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the National Organization for Victim Assistance, and various support groups for bereaved parents exist, but families must often seek these resources out themselves when they're least capable of doing so. Even when support exists, nothing truly prepares anyone for this level of loss. If supernatural elements like possession were real, as in the FNAF law, this would add additional dimensions to family grief. Knowing that children's spirits were trapped in animatronics rather than at peace would create impossible dilemmas. Should families try to free the spirits through destruction or exorcism? Should they maintain connection by visiting the animatronics? Would they find comfort in believing their children persist in some form, or would it compound the horror? Different religious and spiritual frameworks would guide families to different conclusions, potentially creating conflicts even within single families. The reality is that families who lose children to preventable tragedies at commercial establishments often become fierce advocates for safety improvements and accountability. They channel their grief into preventing other families from experiencing what they've survived. They push for legislation, speak at hearings, educate the public, and refuse to let their children's deaths be forgotten or dismissed as accidents when they resulted from negligence. And this advocacy provides purpose, but also requires them to constantly relive their trauma in service of preventing future tragedies. A real Fazbear Entertainment facing families bereaved by incidents at their facilities would encounter people who wouldn't be satisfied with settlements, corporate apologies, or cosmetic changes. They would demand systemic transformation or closure. They would make the cases public to warn other families. They would resist attempts by the company to move on before real accountability occurred. They would be willing to spend years in litigation if necessary. This kind of determined family advocacy has forced numerous companies to make substantial changes they initially resisted. Understanding family experiences of child loss helps us appreciate the human cost behind the FNAF lore. The games use the missing children as plot elements and the source of the haunting. But in reality, those would be 5 families destroyed, dozens of extended family members devastated, a community traumatized, and ripples of impact that would continue indefinitely. This gravity isn't something the games can or should fully depict because they're entertainment, but contemplating it deepens our understanding of why the scenarios they present are so horrifying and why society works so hard to prevent them. Media and internet response. How the digital age would cover this. In our current era of 24-hour news cycles, social media, true crime podcasts, and viral content, a Fazbear entertainment scandal would receive coverage completely unlike anything possible in the 1980s or 90s. To understand how real-world FNAF incidents would unfold in our timeline, we need to examine how modern media handles missing children cases, corporate scandals, and mysterious circumstances that capture public attention. The immediate response would be local news coverage. When children vanish from a pizzeria, established media protocols suggest local television stations and newspapers send reporters and crews to the location within hours. They interview witnesses, families, law enforcement, and anyone else willing to talk. They broadcast urgent appeals for information. They show photos of the missing children. This coverage is generally earnest and focused on aiding the investigation, though questions about media ethics arise when reporters become aggressive in pursuing grieving families. Within a day or two, based on patterns from similar high-profile cases, the story likely goes national. Cable news networks pick it up, especially CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, which all have segments focused on missing children and criminal cases. Primetime anchors discuss the case. Experts are brought in to analyze the investigation, though their actual expertise varies. Nancy Grace-type programs would certainly seize on it, presenting the case with dramatic intensity and speculation. This national exposure serves the purpose of spreading awareness, but also sensationalizes tragedy in ways that can be exploitative. Social media activation occurs almost instantly. As soon as news breaks, people begin sharing information on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. Hashtags emerge organically or are created deliberately by advocacy groups, and images of the missing children circulate widely. Amateur sleuths begin speculating about what happened, mapping the location, analyzing whatever information is publicly available. This distributed attention can help investigations by generating tips, but it also creates massive misinformation and can harm innocent people who get incorrectly identified as suspicious. The phenomenon of internet detectives or Reddit detectives would absolutely activate around a Fazbear case. Online communities dedicated to true crime would create extensive threads compiling every piece of public information. They would analyze security footage frame by frame if any leaked. They would investigate the company's history, its employees, and anyone connected to the case. Some of this crowdsourced investigation has occasionally helped real cases, but more often it leads to false accusations and harassment of innocent individuals who happen to fit some profile or live near the location. Conspiracy theories would proliferate rapidly. Even in straightforward cases, conspiracy theorists develop alternative narratives. In a case involving missing children and animatronics, where mysterious circumstances exist, theories would explode across social media. Some would claim government cover-ups. Others would insist on paranormal explanations. Still others would blame various groups based on pre-existing ideological commitments. Debunking these theories would be difficult because believers interpret skepticism as proof of conspiracy rather than as evidence against their claims. True crime podcasts would dedicate episodes to the case, possibly entire series, and this genre has exploded in popularity, with dozens of successful podcasts examining historical and contemporary criminal cases in exhaustive detail. A Fazbear incident would be irresistible content. Podcasters would interview anyone willing to talk, analyze public records, present theories, and keep the case in public consciousness. This sustained attention can help maintain pressure on investigators and keep cases from going cold. But it also risks becoming entertainment that treats real tragedy as content to be consumed. YouTube creators would produce video content from multiple angles. True crime channels would examine the case. Technology channels might explore animatronic systems to explain how the equipment could malfunction. Paranormal channels would discuss haunting possibilities, while news commentary channels would analyze the corporate response. Some of this content would be well researched and thoughtful, while much would be sensationalized or poorly sourced. The monetization of tragedy through ad revenue on viral content creates ethical tensions that platform policies only partially address. TikTok would see both helpful and harmful responses. On the helpful side, short videos spreading awareness of missing children can reach enormous audiences quickly, potentially generating the tips that solve cases. On the harmful side, TikTok trends around true crime often trivialize tragedy, with users creating entertainment content using real criminal cases as backdrops. Videos claiming to show paranormal activity at the location would likely emerge, and whether authentic documentation of unusual experiences or complete fabrications designed to go viral. Corporate response in the social media age faces challenges that didn't exist in previous eras. Fazbear Entertainment would need active social media management to respond to the crisis. Saying nothing would be interpreted negatively, but statements can be picked apart and turned against the company. They would face calls for boycotts organized through hashtags. Negative reviews would flood their business pages. Employees might speak out on social media, either defending or condemning the company. The company's every statement and action would be documented, analyzed, memed, and either supported or attacked depending on observer perspectives. Online activism would likely organize around the case, and change.org petitions would demand the company be shut down, that regulations be strengthened, that specific actions be taken. These petitions can gather hundreds of thousands of signatures and create political pressure, though their actual impact on outcomes varies. Facebook groups would form for people following the case, sometimes becoming toxic environments where misinformation spreads and participants harass anyone they've decided is suspicious. Other groups might genuinely support investigation and advocacy. The documentary treatment would inevitably follow. Netflix, Hulu, HBO, and other streaming services have made true crime documentaries a major genre. A case involving missing children, corporate negligence, mysterious circumstances, and potential paranormal elements would be irresistible to producers, and multiple competing documentaries might race to be first, interviewing families, investigators, employees, experts, and anyone else who would participate. These documentaries would reach millions of viewers and shape public understanding of what happened, for better or worse, depending on how well they're made. The Gabby Petito case offers an instructive example of how modern media covers missing person cases. When Petito vanished in 2021 and her remains were later found, the case received extraordinary coverage, driven partly by social media interest. Every development was analyzed in real time by millions of people. Internet sleuths combed through the couple's social media posts and the boyfriend's suspicious behavior, and the coverage eventually helped locate her remains, but also highlighted disparities in how much attention different missing person cases receive based on factors like the victim's appearance, race, and social media presence. This missing white woman syndrome would likely apply to a FNAF case depending on the victim's demographics. Cases involving white children from middle-class families receive disproportionate coverage compared to cases involving children of color, poor children, or children from troubled backgrounds. This disparity is well documented and troubling, reflecting broader societal biases. A FNAF scenario involving a diverse group of victims might see uneven coverage that focused more on some children than others, causing additional pain to families who feel their children are being overlooked. The speed of information spread in the digital age also creates challenges for investigations. Law enforcement traditionally controlled what information became public, allowing them to hold back details that only the perpetrator would know, which helps verify confessions and eliminate false leads. In the social media era, witnesses immediately post what they saw, security footage leaks, employees share insider information, and maintaining investigative control becomes nearly impossible. This transparency has benefits, but also allows sophisticated criminals to follow investigation progress and adjust accordingly. Misinformation and disinformation complicate everything. Well-meaning people share inaccurate information that they believe is true. Malicious actors deliberately create false information to confuse, deflect blame, or pursue other agendas. Distinguishing truth from fiction becomes increasingly difficult as false claims are shared thousands of times before corrections can reach the same audiences. Law enforcement has to spend resources debunking false leads generated by internet rumors. Families face harassment based on false accusations. The information ecosystem becomes polluted in ways that harm rather than help. The long-term digital footprint of such a case would persist indefinitely. Unlike past eras where media coverage eventually faded and cases were forgotten except by those directly involved, internet coverage creates permanent records. Years or decades later, anyone could search the victims' names and find extensive discussion of their deaths. Family members would carry the burden of knowing this documentation exists permanently. The victims would be defined by their deaths rather than their lives, frozen forever in true crime content, unable to be remembered primarily for who they were rather than how they died. However, digital media also enables positive outcomes impossible in previous eras. Awareness campaigns can reach millions. Fundraising for victim services and investigation costs can happen at scale. Long cold cases can be revived through renewed interest sparked by podcasts or documentaries. Genealogical databases that people use for ancestry research have helped solve decades-old cases by identifying suspects through familial DNA. The same technologies and platforms that create challenges also create opportunities for justice and support. The modern media landscape means a Fazbear Entertainment scandal would be documented, discussed, analyzed, and remembered in ways completely different from how similar events were handled in past decades. The company would face scrutiny that couldn't be escaped or outlasted. The families would have support networks, but also invasive attention. The investigations would benefit from public engagement, but also face interference from amateur involvement. Understanding this media reality is essential to comprehending how FNAF scenarios would actually unfold in our timeline, where information moves instantly and permanently, where everyone with a phone is a potential journalist, and where public attention can be both a powerful tool and a devastating burden. Legal aftermath, courts, trials, and the pursuit of justice. The legal consequences of a real Fazbear Entertainment scenario would be extensive, complex, and lasting. To understand what would actually happen in our justice system, we need to examine both criminal prosecutions and civil litigation, the different standards they employ, and how they interact to create accountability when businesses fail in their obligations to protect customers and especially children. Criminal proceedings would begin if evidence suggested that crimes occurred. In the case of children disappearing and evidence pointing toward foul play, potential charges could include kidnapping, murder, concealment of homicide, tampering with evidence, and depending on specifics, potentially additional crimes like abuse of a corpse. If the perpetrator was an employee and the company had reason to know they posed a risk, but failed to prevent access to children, your corporate officers might face charges of criminal negligence or reckless endangerment. The investigation phase of criminal cases involves law enforcement gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a case that prosecutors can present to a grand jury or directly file charges depending on jurisdiction. In high-profile cases involving children, prosecutors face enormous public pressure to bring charges quickly, but they must balance this pressure against the need to build strong cases that will survive trial. Premature charges based on insufficient evidence can result in acquittals that prevent retrying the defendant due to double jeopardy protections. Grand jury proceedings allow prosecutors to present evidence and have citizens determine whether probable cause exists to charge someone with crimes, and grand juries hear only the prosecution's case and operate in secret, allowing prosecutors significant control over the process. If they return indictments, the defendant is formally charged and the case proceeds to arraignment where they enter pleas. Given the severity of child murder charges, defendants typically plead not guilty, leading to pre-trial proceedings and eventually trial. Pre-trial proceedings include discovery where both sides exchange evidence, pre-trial motions where legal issues are resolved before trial, and negotiations about potential plea bargains. Even in serious cases, plea bargains are common because they provide certainty of conviction and punishment while avoiding the risk, expense, and time of trial. A defendant might plead guilty to some charges in exchange for dismissal of others or for sentencing recommendations. Families often struggle with plea bargains because they feel cheated of full accountability, but prosecutors sometimes accept them to avoid risks of acquittal. If cases go to trial, the prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, a high standard that protects innocent people but sometimes allows guilty ones to escape conviction. Trials in murder cases can last weeks or months. Evidence is presented methodically. Witnesses are examined and cross-examined. Expert testimony about forensics, psychology, or other specialized topics is offered. The defense presents their case, which might include alibi evidence, challenges to prosecution evidence, or alternative explanations for what happened, and juries ultimately decide guilt or innocence based on the evidence and instructions about law provided by the judge. The standard of proof in criminal cases, beyond a reasonable doubt, is deliberately high because we prioritize avoiding false convictions of innocent people. This means that sometimes people who are factually guilty aren't convicted because the evidence, while suggesting guilt, doesn't eliminate all reasonable doubts. This frustrates a victim's families, but reflects a deliberate choice in our legal system to err on the side of protecting defendants' rights. Sentencing follows conviction. For the most serious crimes like murder, sentences can include life imprisonment without parole, or, in some states, the death penalty. Factors considered in sentencing include the nature of the crimes, the defendant's history, our impact on victims, and whether statutory aggravating factors exist like killing children or multiple victims. Victim impact statements allow families to address the court about how the crimes affected them, providing a voice in proceedings where they otherwise have limited formal roles. Civil litigation proceeds on parallel tracks and uses different standards. Families of victims would file wrongful death lawsuits against Fazbear Entertainment, possibly also naming individual officers or employees as defendants. These cases allege that the company's negligence caused the deaths and seek monetary damages as compensation. The standard of proof is preponderance of the evidence, essentially, more likely than not, which is much lower than criminal cases beyond a reasonable doubt. This means defendants can be found civilly liable even if they weren't convicted criminally or were never charged. Civil discovery is much more expansive than criminal discovery. Plaintiff attorneys can request virtually any documents potentially relevant to their claims. They can depose company employees and officers under oath. They can hire expert witnesses to examine equipment, analyze procedures, and testify about industry standards. This process often reveals information the company wanted to keep private, including internal communications showing they knew about problems, previous incidents they concealed, or cost-benefit analyses where they chose profits over safety. The discovery of damaging internal documents has destroyed defendants in many famous cases, and when litigation revealed Ford's cost-benefit analysis, choosing not to fix the Pinto's fuel system, juries were outraged. When tobacco company documents showed they knew cigarettes were addictive and cancer-causing while publicly denying it, the industry's credibility collapsed. A Fazbear Entertainment case where discovery revealed they knew animatronics posed risks but failed to address them, that previous incidents occurred but were covered up, or that they prioritized cost savings over child safety would create similar outcomes. Settlements are common in civil cases because both sides face uncertainty at trial. Plaintiffs might lose and receive nothing. Defendants might face enormous verdicts that could bankrupt the company. Settlement negotiations often occur with the assistance of mediators and neutral third parties who facilitate discussions without deciding outcomes. Settlements typically include confidentiality provisions, though courts are increasingly skeptical of these when they could conceal public safety issues. When cases do go to civil trial, juries determine both liability and damages. Liability questions address whether the defendant's negligence caused the harm. Damages questions address how much compensation is appropriate. In cases involving children's deaths, juries tend to award substantial damages because of the profound loss. They can award compensatory damages for economic losses like lost future earnings and non-economic losses like pain and suffering and loss of companionship. They can also award punitive damages if they find the defendant's behavior was particularly egregious, intentionally harmful, or showed reckless disregard for safety. Punitive damages serve to punish defendants and deter similar conduct by others. Courts typically require that punitive damages be proportional to compensatory damages, but the ratios accepted vary by jurisdiction. In truly egregious cases, punitive damages can be many times larger than compensatory damages. These large punitive awards make headlines and send strong messages to entire industries about the costs of negligence. Class action lawsuits could also emerge if many people were harmed. For example, if Fazbear entertainment locations across the country had similar problems, customers who were endangered but not physically harmed might bring class actions seeking compensation for emotional distress and demanding changes to company practices. Class actions allow large numbers of plaintiffs with similar claims to be handled together efficiently, though they're controversial because settlements often provide small individual payouts while generating large attorney fees. Regulatory proceedings parallel both criminal and civil cases. OSHA might impose fines for workplace safety violations. State agencies regulating amusement safety might revoke operating permits. Local health departments might suspend food service permits. Each regulatory action creates separate penalties and can force operational changes independent of what courts order. Companies must respond to multiple simultaneous proceedings, stretching their legal resources and increasing pressure to settle or cease operations. Bankruptcy becomes a likely option for companies facing enormous liability. A filing for bankruptcy protection stops most litigation temporarily through an automatic stay, giving the company breathing room to reorganize. The bankruptcy court oversees a process where assets are evaluated, liabilities are assessed, and a plan is developed to either reorganize and continue operating under new terms or liquidate and distribute assets to creditors. Victims with claims become creditors in bankruptcy, though their claims compete with other creditors, including secured lenders who have priority. Bankruptcy can substantially reduce what victims receive because the company's total assets might not cover all claims. If Fazbear Entertainment owes hundreds of millions in judgments and settlements but has only tens of millions in assets, victims receive pennies on the dollar. This frustrating reality means that even winning litigation doesn't guarantee full compensation. Insurance might cover some claims, but often has limits and exclusions. The pursuit of justice through legal proceedings doesn't always produce the outcomes families hope for. Appeals extend the process further. Both criminal convictions and civil verdicts can be appealed, though appeals courts review legal errors rather than redeciding facts. Criminal defendants have strong appeal rights because of liberty interests, while civil appeal rights are more limited. Appeals take years, during which outcomes remain uncertain and families remain in limbo. Some cases go through multiple levels of appeal, reaching state supreme courts or even federal courts if constitutional issues are raised. The public record created by legal proceedings provides lasting documentation of what happened. Court filings, transcripts, and decisions become public documents that researchers, journalists, and anyone else can access. This creates accountability because companies can't simply bury their failures. Future cases can reference previous decisions. Patterns of behavior across multiple cases become evident. The legal system's documentation function serves society even when individual case outcomes are imperfect. Legal representation quality dramatically affects outcomes. Victims' families with resources can hire experienced plaintiff firms that specialize in wrongful death and product liability cases. These firms have expertise, resources to fund expensive litigation, including expert witnesses, and track records that insurance companies take seriously. Families without resources might struggle to find representation because these cases are expensive to pursue, even on contingency. This creates justice disparities based on economic status that conflict with our ideal of equal access to legal remedies. The long-term impact of legal proceedings on a company like Fazbear Entertainment would likely be fatal. between criminal penalties, civil judgments, regulatory fines, increased insurance costs, and reputation damage, the financial and operational burdens would be insurmountable. Even if the company survived bankruptcy reorganization, consumer trust would be destroyed. Landlords would terminate leases. Franchise operators would rebrand. Suppliers would demand cash payments. The business model would collapse. Understanding the legal system's response to corporate negligence causing child deaths reveals why the FNAF scenario of ongoing operations across decades is implausible in our timeline. The legal mechanisms exist specifically to hold businesses accountable and to force unsafe operations to either transform or close. These mechanisms aren't perfect. Innocent companies sometimes face frivolous suits, while guilty ones sometimes escape full accountability. But the overall system creates substantial pressure towards safety and responsibility. A real Fazbear Entertainment would encounter this pressure in overwhelming force, making continuation of dangerous operations extremely difficult regardless of corporate desires. Conclusion. Living in a world with real Fazbear Entertainment. After this extensive exploration of what would happen if Five Nights at Freddy's became reality, we can now synthesize our understanding into a comprehensive picture of how such a scenario would actually unfold in our timeline. The comparison between the game's fiction and our reality reveals both the deliberate departures necessary for horror storytelling and the robust systems our society has built to prevent exactly these kinds of tragedies. The technological reality is that while animatronic entertainment absolutely exists and is commercially viable, the specific implementations in FNAF face serious obstacles. Real animatronics are impressive, but prone to malfunction even with excellent maintenance, as we see at Disney parks. The spring-lock suits, and if they could exist at all, would represent such extraordinary safety hazards that no regulatory body would approve them for commercial use. A real Fazbear Entertainment could operate animatronic shows, but they would be simpler, more carefully controlled, and subject to extensive regulation compared to what the games depict. The business model of family entertainment centers combining food service with animatronic shows is challenging economically, even without incidents. Companies like Chuck E. Cheese have struggled with the high costs of equipment maintenance, the competitive market for family entertainment, and changing consumer preferences. A Fazbear Entertainment would face these same pressures, making them vulnerable to cost-cutting that could compromise safety. However, the moment serious incidents occurred, and the cascade of regulatory action, insurance problems, legal liability, and reputation damage would likely drive rapid closure rather than allowing decades of troubled operation. The investigative response to missing children in our timeline is comprehensive, immediate, and sustained. FBI card teams, local law enforcement, NCMEC, and other agencies mobilize resources that would make the cover-ups implied in FNAF law extraordinarily difficult. The modern tools available to investigators, from DNA analysis to digital forensics to genealogical databases, mean that even cold cases from decades past are being solved. A case involving multiple children vanishing from a single location would become one of the most heavily investigated crimes in that jurisdiction's history. The supernatural claims that might arise around reportedly haunted animatronics would receive mixed responses. Some portion of the public would absolutely believe the location was haunted. Paranormal investigators would examine it. Media would cover it as entertainment. But institutional responses from law enforcement, courts, regulators, and engineers would remain grounded in natural explanations. the animatronics would be examined for mechanical problems, not spiritually cleansed, because our entire governmental and legal framework operates on naturalistic assumptions. The corporate accountability systems we've built, imperfect as they are, create substantial pressure on businesses to either operate safely or cease operating. The combination of criminal prosecution possibilities and civil litigation with discovery and potentially massive damages, regulatory oversight from multiple agencies, insurance requirements, and media scrutiny means that companies experiencing the kinds of incidents Fazbear Entertainment faces would be forced to either transform completely or close. The cover-ups that seem to occur in the law would face numerous obstacles and would almost certainly eventually be exposed, resulting in consequences more severe than transparency would have produced. The human cost behind the FNAF law, the families who would be destroyed by losing children, the workers who would suffer psychological trauma, the community that would be affected. This reality doesn't diminish the games as entertainment, but it does highlight why society works so hard to prevent such tragedies. The systems we've examined, investigations, regulations, legal accountability, aren't perfect and don't prevent all harm, but they represent collective efforts to protect people, especially children, from preventable dangers. The modern media and information environment would ensure that a Fazbear scandal couldn't be quietly buried or forgotten. Social media would spread awareness instantly. True crime podcasts and documentaries would examine every detail. Internet communities would investigate and discuss the case endlessly. The permanent digital record would prevent the kind of historical amnesia that might have been possible in earlier eras. This transparency serves accountability, even though it can also invade privacy and spread misinformation. Working night security at a location with disturbing history would be extraordinarily challenging psychologically, but workers would have rights and protections that should prevent them from being forced to remain in genuinely dangerous conditions. The employment relationship shown in the games, where guards return night after night despite mounting danger, wouldn't be sustainable in reality because workers can quit, can refuse unsafe conditions, and can report problems to authorities. The business would face pressure to address problems or lose the ability to staff security positions. What this examination reveals is that while the core concept of a family restaurant with animatronic entertainment could exist, and while individual incidents of malfunction or even tragedy could occur, the specific trajectory shown across the FNAF timeline, multiple serious incidents across multiple locations over decades, with a company continuing to operate and patterns not being fully addressed, would be extraordinarily unlikely in our timeline. Drawing from documented responses to similar real-world incidents, the systems we've built are designed, through hard lessons learned from real tragedies, to identify and stop dangerous operations before they can harm many people. This doesn't mean our systems are perfect. Corporate negligence still occurs. Cover-ups are attempted. People still get hurt or killed due to preventable failures. Children still go missing. But the response to these events in our reality is generally swift, comprehensive, and focused on accountability and prevention, rather than allowing continued operation unchanged. The horror of FNAF relies on a world where these systems fail or are circumvented, where pattern recognition doesn't lead to intervention, where families' grief doesn't translate into action. That world makes for compelling gaming, but diverges significantly from our reality. Understanding these differences enriches our appreciation of both the games and the real protections we have. The games create atmosphere and narrative through scenarios that violate our expectations of how businesses and authorities should behave. The tension comes partly from knowing that what's happening shouldn't be allowed to happen, that adults who should protect children are failing to do so. This taps into real anxieties about trusted institutions and authority figures, but it requires accepting premises that wouldn't hold in our world's legal and regulatory frameworks. If we lived in a world where a real Fazbear Entertainment operated, we would want robust systems to ensure child safety, to investigate thoroughly when problems occurred, to hold businesses accountable for negligence, and to prevent dangerous operations from continuing. Looking at our actual world, we can see that while imperfect, we do have many of these systems in place. They exist because previous tragedies taught us their necessity. They're maintained by professionals who take child safety seriously. They're backed by laws that prioritize protection over profit. And they're supported by a public that generally agrees children deserve special protection. The educational value of exploring what if FNAF was real is that it helps us understand both the fiction and the reality more deeply. We appreciate the game's creative departures from reality while also gaining insight into how our world actually functions. We understand why certain scenarios make compelling horror, while recognizing why they wouldn't unfold the same way in our timeline. We see the systems that protect us working in the background of our daily lives, preventing tragedies we never even know could have occurred. For those of us who love the Five Nights at Freddy's series, this exploration doesn't diminish that love. Fiction doesn't need to perfectly mirror reality to be valuable, entertaining, and meaningful. The games succeed brilliantly at what they set out to do: create atmospheric horror, build intriguing lore, and deliver satisfying gameplay, and tell stories that resonate emotionally. Understanding how reality differs from fiction enhances rather than undermines our appreciation, because it highlights the creative choices that make the games work. As we conclude this journey through the intersection of FNAF and reality, we're left with a complex picture. Yes, a business like Fazbear Entertainment could exist in our world, at least initially. Yes, animatronics can malfunction in disturbing ways. Yes, corporate negligence happens. Yes, children are tragically sometimes harmed in places that should be safe. But the specific combination of events shown in FNAF, the sustained pattern of incidents without effective intervention, the successful cover-ups, the continued operation across decades, and these elements require accepting premises that don't align with how our legal, regulatory, investigative, and social systems actually function when faced with such scenarios. This conclusion doesn't answer every question we could ask about FNAF in reality, because the lore is rich and extensive and reality is complex. But hopefully, it provides framework for thinking about these questions, understanding the systems that govern business operations and protect vulnerable people in our world, and appreciating both the fiction of the games and the reality we navigate daily. The horror of FNAF stems partly from scenarios we hope could never really happen, and examining why they probably couldn't in our timeline helps us understand both the fiction and our reality more fully. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of what would happen if Five Nights at Freddy's came to real life. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the intersection of gaming lore and real-world systems, please like and subscribe to support more content like this. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments about which aspects of this topic were most interesting, or what other elements of FNAF you'd like to see examined through a real-world lens. Until next time, sweet dreams, and remember that the systems protecting us in reality, while imperfect, are much more robust than the worlds where horror stories unfold.